We are ready, correct?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the first part of our hearing, the Amtrak Gulf Coast matter. We will continue with the public participation part we began yesterday. A reminder for people who are not on any panel speaking to mute your microphones, mute your cell phones if your microphone is on. And we're going to begin with people who were unfortunately unable to stick with us yesterday. I understand that J.W. Madison is available this morning by telephone. Let me just mention there were 3 other people who did not appear yesterday who were on the list. And I want to ask if any of them are available. If they are, we will hear them first after Mr. Madison. Barney Bishop, Michael Hines, Julio Fuentes, and John James. Are any of them on the program this morning? All right. Well, if they do eventually come, we will still happy to call on them. In the meantime, let us start with Mr. Madison from Rail Inc. Mr. Madison, proceed.
Yes. Can everybody hear me? Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, how about now? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Lord. Oh, okay. Well, so I can start now?
Go right ahead.
Okay. My group, Rails Incorporated, is from New Mexico, is a bunch of so-called ordinary citizens who have learned some great things about passenger rail and don't like what we've been missing for at least 50 years. You've heard about the many advantages of modern passenger rail. I would add almost unbelievable fuel economy, that is, smaller carbon footprint, greater passenger safety, comfort, and peace of mind, and popularity with people of all ages, colors, and income levels. The demand for more and better trains is there, and it's increasing. The supply has been strangled for decades. We think, however, that a new day may be dawning for Amtrak and national passenger rail in general, so we hope. Examples of this are their Connect US 2035 initiative, which to us is a modest step in the right direction, and of present interest, the proposal we're talking about today. CSX says that accommodating both freight and passenger service here requires various improvements to the right-of-way. Everybody seems to agree on this, including us. But things like overly long freight trains need to be factored in here to really get anywhere. What really troubles us is the huge difference between 2 cost estimates we've seen. The FRA's $118 million versus CSX's $2.3 billion. Here's an example from my paid career. I'm a small-scale electrical and general contractor by trade. If you're collecting bids for some improvements on your house, and these bids range from about $700 to maybe $1,300, and I come in demanding almost $20,000, wouldn't you smell at least one rat? Whatever CSX is trying to pull here, in my group's opinion, bears no resemblance to any workable negotiating process I ever heard of. If we accept the FRA's cost estimate, which my group considers to be at least a ballpark baseline for setting down in good faith, what does CSX plan to do with all that extra money? Giving in to CSX's predatory demands would hold the rest of our sketchy passenger rail network hostage to further sabotage by a few big freight entities and their preferred shareholders. We also feel that if the taxpayers across our country are going to shell out for these improvements, we should own them, and that this policy be an early step toward the conversion of all our major track segments into a national public utility, with lots of room for both public and private moving parts, and even for the profit motive. My group calls this dream system the rail interstate. We thought of interstate rail system, but we figured another IRS might not resonate quite like we want it to. Although Rails Inc., being from New Mexico, concerns itself primarily with Western rail and transit matters, we're involved in this Southern issue because we believe that how the STB handles this case will reverberate for better or worse all across America for decades to come. Thanks to PRIA, the connectivity of our national passenger rail system is skimpy enough. If big freight gets its way in these proceedings, national passenger rail will be further balkanized in our country. This case is a major opportunity for the STB to strike a blow for good transportation and a cleaner, safer environment in America for generations to come. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Madison, and thank you for your persistence in staying with us so we could hear your very cogent remarks. Much appreciated.
Sir, I thank you, sir. I appreciate that we're all kind of feeling our way through this brave new world of virtual everything.
I think you have spoken for all of us. Thank you on that point.
Thank you. Should I stay on the line or mute myself?
You're welcome to continue to attend the hearing, but if you would please mute yourself, that would be helpful.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right. Now I'm going to call up panel 11, and I'm going to read off everybody to see if they are here. Charles Moorman. I understand Thelma Drake may not be on yet. Is Ms. Drake on? All right.
Yes, I am on.
Oh, you are here. Okay, very good. Alex Ayers, Ray Chambers, Theodore Stamos, Timothy Lee, Gerard Semeka, Virgil Payne. Aha, there's another Drake. That was my mistake. Alan Drake, I think, may not be with us. And Patrick Cagle. And if Mr. Drake is able to come later, we'll certainly try to hear from him. So with that, Wick Moorman, it's our honor to have you here, former CEO of both Amtrak and NSR, a unique platform from which to enlighten us on this matter. Wick, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Hopefully there's at least a modest amount of enlightenment, Mr. Chairman. Good morning,
okay,
everyone.
We'll take whatever enlightenment you can give us.
Good morning, Chairman Oberman, Vice Chairman Schultz, and board members Primus, Fuchs, and Headland. It's good to see all of you virtually. I am Wick Moorman, and I'm delighted to be with you today, even if it's not in person, and I do appreciate you giving me the time to speak. I will start, because I haven't met many of you, with just a bit about my background. I worked for the Southern Railway as an engineering co-op student. In 1970, I started while I was studying civil engineering at Georgia Tech. I graduated in 75. I joined Southern's engineering department and worked in Maintenance Way, the track department, for 12 years. Left what was by then Norfolk Southern in 1987 to attend business school. And after I received my MBA in '89, I returned to Norfolk Southern, where I held positions in transportation and corporate planning, HR, and IT. I was appointed Norfolk Southern's president and CEO in 2005, and I served in that position until my retirement in 2015. A year later, I joined Amtrak as its president and CEO. I will say, to my wife's total disgust, I did that on an interim basis and served as CEO and then co-CEO for about 16 months. Since 2020, I've been a member of the board of the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, which was created to oversee and advance Virginia's very ambitious efforts to expand passenger rail service throughout the state. And the reason for my speaking today is not to take any particular side in this issue, but rather to hopefully help give some perspective as to how it should be resolved. And I feel that I'm qualified to do that because during the time I was CEO of Norfolk Southern, we were able to reach agreements with Amtrak, Virginia, and North Carolina that resulted in significant expansion of Amtrak service in those states. This included a new Amtrak route from Washington to Norfolk that operates over Norfolk Southern between Petersburg and Norfolk, a new train from Washington to Lynchburg that was later extended to Roanoke, and additional Amtrak service on North Carolina's Piedmont corridor between Raleigh and Charlotte. And I felt then, and I still feel now, that these agreements were a win-win for Norfolk Southern, Amtrak, and the people who live in Virginia and North Carolina. The Amtrak services have been very successful, attracting high ridership and leading to additional service increases. And very importantly, there has been significant public investment in Norfolk Southern's rail lines as a result of the Amtrak services. I first became involved with the proposed Amtrak service along the Gulf Coast in 2017, and that was after the conversations had been going on for a few years before I got there. I was Amtrak CEO, as I said, at the time, and I did make a commitment to the Southern Rail Commission and to Senator Wicker, who I understand you heard from earlier, that Amtrak would support the restoration of service along the Gulf Coast. At the time, CSX was seeking over $2 billion in infrastructure investments to restore service from New Orleans all the way to Jacksonville and add a second train from New Orleans to Mobile. And CSX was also claiming that it was virtually impossible to add Amtrak service because they couldn't meet the 80% on-time performance standard in the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act. I was optimistic at that time that Amtrak would be able to reach agreement with CSX, given the experience I'd already had working out agreements with Amtrak and the states at Norfolk Southern. I reached out to Hunter Harrison, whom I knew fairly well, who was then CSX's CEO. I'd known Hunter for a number of years, and I suggested that we get together to talk. He agreed, but unfortunately that never happened. This was during the period when Hunter was very ill, and of course, sadly, he died a few months later. By the time I left Amtrak at the end of 2017, it seemed increasingly apparent that there wasn't going to be an agreement with CSX. And now, of course, 4 years later, it appears, at least to me, that little, if anything, has changed. And that's very unfortunate. While negotiations over these types of projects are never easy, they shouldn't take forever. If you have reasonable people on both sides, they can get done, as I have seen many times. And it does seem clear to me that a neutral party needs to step in and come up with a resolution. And it's also very clear to me that the STB is the right entity to do that. A few additional comments about this issue. The first is my belief that there is a real need for passenger rail service, particularly in the South. As we all know, our highway system is overcrowded in many areas and in an increasing state of disrepair. And the appetite for good, alternative, environmentally friendly transportation as alternatives to driving is growing. A great example is the train Amtrak added from Washington to Lynchburg while I was at NS, in which serves Charlottesville, where I live. It's been enormously successful, and I used it regularly to commute to Washington while I was CEO of Amtrak. Its early success, that train's early success, has been one of the drivers of Virginia's really audacious plan to spend $3.7 billion on improving rail passenger service in the state, including, and the bulk of the funding is for this, a new rail bridge over the Potomac River, along with increased service to Richmond, which will provide some relief to the long-suffering drivers who have to get on I-95, and new service all the way to the new River Valley and Virginia Tech. And all of this, by the way, was done with agreements with CSX and with Norfolk Southern, and with additional investments for capacity in both railroads. A second point is that until the Amtrak Lynchburg train on Norfolk Southern started in 2009, Virginia had very little Amtrak service other than a few long-distance trains. And one thing that I've seen in Virginia is that once states and communities see the benefits of passenger rail service, they can't get enough of it. I expect that will also be the case on the Gulf Coast. And I'm particularly encouraged that, as in Virginia, there's strong bipartisan support there for passenger rail service. It's one of the major reasons that passenger rail in Virginia has been able to secure the funding that has enabled its growth. A third point I'd make is that Norfolk, where Norfolk Southern was headquartered while I was CEO, has a lot in common with Mobile. Both cities have ports that are crucial to their economies and are heavily dependent on rail service. Norfolk, which is a substantially larger port than Mobile, is one of the most important terminals on Norfolk Southern's network. It's the eastern endpoint of Norfolk Southern's Heartland corridor, and both intermodal and export coal shipments are exchanged there between ship and rail. And I understand that yesterday, and I understand why, some of the speakers were concerned about the impact of Amtrak service on freight rail service to Mobile's port. We had similar concerns about the impact on Norfolk, but I can tell you we worked collaboratively with Amtrak to identify what capacity was required for the additional trains. That capacity was installed, and the initiation of Amtrak service to Norfolk in 2012 over the NS line did not have any detrimental impact on the port's rail service. I'll close by addressing for a couple of minutes another issue mentioned, I understand, again by some of the speakers yesterday: rail line capacity modeling, so-called RTC modeling. Let me be clear at the outset, I am not familiar at all with the modeling that was done by the parties in this case. I do, however, have a lot of experience with capacity modeling, including the RTC model from the years I spent in transportation and strategic planning positions at NS. And in particular, I've been involved with capacity modeling studies for passenger rail operators and public entities in connection with proposed increases in passenger or freight service. For that process, and it is a process to use the models to develop an agreement, there must be some essential steps taken. First, the parties to the modeling studies must be in agreement on the assumptions and the inputs that will be used. There must also be transparency. And when I say transparency, I'm talking about transparency between the parties involved, not necessarily the general public. Most of the information that's required for capacity modeling, such as the physical characteristics of the rail line and the details of the freight operations over it, is known only to the rail line's owner. Some of that information is proprietary, but that can be addressed by confidentiality agreements that don't inhibit the sharing of data among the parties to the modeling. And then using those initial inputs, the model can and should be calibrated to make sure that it accurately reflects the existing operations and the delays that are encountered on the existing operations before any passenger trains are run. You then add the additional proposed trains and continue to run the model to determine the average passenger train delay and the additional freight train delay, if any, with no additional investment. And then finally, with that analysis in hand, the model can be used to analyze the impact of various proposed capacity improvements. And the key concept here, obviously, is bang for the buck, maximizing daily reductions at the lowest possible cost. The key in all of this is you cannot effectively use a capacity modeling tool like RTC unless there is a commitment to a fair process and a willingness to negotiate on both sides. The results of the modeling must be shared and transparent, as I said before, to both parties. And this is particularly important in Amtrak's case, as agencies like the FRA insist upon showing that projects are efficient and that all of the investments for which funding is sought are necessary to achieve the project's purpose before they'll ever award grants. And one other important point to make about capacity modeling, it isn't just about tallying up a list of capital projects. When railroads are looking to address capacity issues, building infrastructure is always the last choice because of its expense, both in terms of capital and ongoing maintenance. And that holds true even for railway engineers like me who think rail infrastructure is a wonderful thing. Effective modeling involves figuring out not only what to build, but what you don't need to build. And often there are alternatives, such as tweaking schedules or implementing operational efficiencies that will minimize the need for expensive infrastructure investments. And if all the parties aren't invited to the table during capacity modeling, such alternatives are likely to be ignored. And by the way, this isn't only true about discussions on passenger service. At Norfolk Southern, we used RTC modeling extensively when evaluating additional intermodal train service on our Crescent Corridor. And our intermodal department was intensively involved in the decisions about where to spend money on capacity improvements, as well as how to best design the service to minimize such expenditures. I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to share my thoughts today, and I look forward to your decision. I'm optimistic that there will be Amtrak service from New Orleans, where I was born, to Mobile in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Wick, thank you very much. Very, very insightful. I think board members may have a few questions for you. Are there any board members who have a question?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Karen, go ahead.
Mr. Moorman, thank you so very much for joining us today and for your significant insights into the process. When I was Deputy Administrator, First Chief Counsel and Deputy Administrator at the FRA, I participated in some of those negotiations regarding the expansions in Virginia. Thank you for commenting on the likely viewpoint of FRA as a grantor in this process. Could you comment a little bit more about why that process was successful? What did the parties bring to the table that allowed them to ultimately reach a negotiated arrangement that was also acceptable to the funding partner?
I think that's a great question. And as I look back, I think that it's to a large extent because Norfolk Southern was always open to conversation and negotiation. We had a mantra for a long time that if anyone wanted to run passenger service of any kind, be it Amtrak, be it Virginia Railway Express, be it any of those people, we were happy to talk. And there were some threshold things that had to happen. The first was something that's not a concern with Amtrak, were the liability issues. And the second was that it could not cause any additional delay. Doesn't mean that passenger trains wouldn't delay freight trains occasionally, but on average that their capacity would be added to prevent the freight railroad from being delayed. And those were and continue to be reasonable positions. And the second, once we got there and everyone understand what we were talking about, it was then a very iterative, really almost collegial process of where everyone, as you know, had a seat at the table, and we shared the data, we shared alternatives, we talked about reasonable on-time train performance, we talked about what needed to be built into agreements. Should there be additional freight trains in the future past, if traffic continued to grow? It was just negotiation and reaching a reasonable agreement. And I think NS was always and always has been committed to that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes. Go ahead, Michelle. Sorry.
Michelle, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Wick, first, thanks so much for your willingness to be here today and for bringing your very unique perspective in this matter. I was wondering if you could just take a moment to address how much infrastructure you think might be needed in these circumstances.
The real answer is I don't know. right? I haven't seen the studies. I am only somewhat familiar with the railroad across the Gulf Coast. I'm clearly more familiar with the 6 or so miles on the so-called Back Bay route of Norfolk Southern in New Orleans, which is a busy route because it's the main interchange between the West and the East in New Orleans. You know, when CSX said it was 2.4 billion to go from New Orleans to Jacksonville, right? That was, I mean, I say this with all due respect to my friends at CSX, that was laughable. But
is that all the respect that's due, Wick?
Beg your pardon?
Is that all the respect that is due for that? Go ahead.
I've studied CSX for 40 years and I never quite understood them. So, but they're a good railroad. I don't know. There's some number. It's not enormous, but it's not insignificant that's required. But I'll go back to this idea of there's a process and there are tools. The RTC model is the tool to understand how do you accomplish what you want to accomplish in terms of Amtrak's on-time performance and reasonable freight train operations, using the model with the idea, let's spend the least we can to accomplish what we need to. And I'll make one other point, which I mentioned tangentially in the testimony, but it's true. It's true at Norfolk Southern, and the NS people would tell you that once you reach that point, there are benefits to Norfolk Southern from having additional infrastructure on the railroad that can benefit your freight train operations when passenger trains aren't out there. So that's why it can be a win-win.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Robert?
Yes, again, I want to thank you for enlightening us this morning. I think your comments were on time and well received. I just have two questions from actually two different sides of the room. Number one, when you were CEO of Amtrak, did you consider the Gulf Coast restart? And if so, you know, what was the process? What sort of difficulties did you encounter with CSX at that time? The second question is just about growth. We heard yesterday from a number of participants about the growth of freight rail in that region, and it seemed they seem to suggest that the growth of freight rail could not exist at the same time as the growth of passenger rail. And just want to get your perspective as, you know, from working on previous deals in Virginia and North Carolina, you know, how the growth of both do you believe the growth of both passenger rail and freight rail, you know, can coexist, you know, on those lines and in those areas?
In terms of the first question, you know, as you know, I wasn't at Amtrak that long, and there were a lot of other things to be done at Amtrak, which were, in my mind, more pressing in terms of kind of organizational alignment and strengthening the corporation as a corporation and as a business. But I looked, the Gulf Coast matter had been going on for a while. I did meet with the Southern Rail Commission. I visited with Senator Wicker, and I guess a couple of other people reached out to Hunter. And I thought at the time, and as I said, I grew up in that part of the world, so I understand at least something about the railroad across the Gulf Coast, that New Orleans and Mobile were the kinds of city pairs that ultimately Amtrak wants to address in terms of where there's clearly a ridership base and interest from the local folks. And so it seemed like a good idea to me that it was the kind of place we wanted to do it. And therefore, I took at least some initiative in trying to move it forward. I think that this whole issue of growth either in passenger or in freight, is something that's easily dealt with, right? And has been dealt with at Norfolk Southern in terms of, here are the existing conditions. Here are the however many trains you run, they run across the Gulf Coast, 8, 10, or 12 trains a day or whatever it is. And then agreement is made, and then the Amtrak trains start to run. And there are triggers in the agreement. If it gets to the point where traffic has grown X%, freight traffic has grown X%, you run the model again. You know, you have triggers that initiate further response in terms of what actions are required. You don't have to just build an agreement that's set in stone forever. You build an agreement that has some flexibility in what might happen and the steps that both parties will take if it does happen. It's not particularly hard to figure that out. At least it's not hard to figure out the triggers and the next steps you would take.
Thank you.
Any other board members have any questions? Wick, I have a couple of questions that I wonder if you've dealt with in your experience, either at NS or at Amtrak, in terms of expanding passenger service. One is, do you have any insight, any experience with working with the Coast Guard to organize these bridge openings in a way that minimizes interference with train crossings, you know, beyond the statutory preference for boat owners?
No, we don't. There's no route on, I mean, there are bodies, I guess maybe worked with the Coast Guard or probably ports in a couple of places. There are a couple of big drawbridges in Norfolk, but there aren't drawbridges in the way there are across the Gulf Coast line. Our lines just go straight inland. And so we don't, that is, you know, an issue you have to work through.
Yeah. All right. And the other question I had was, in the various negotiations you've been involved in, and you pointed out that infrastructure improvements, perhaps instigated because of passenger service, sometimes benefit the freight operations regardless of passenger service. What was there any aspect of the negotiations you've been involved in where the cost of the infrastructure was apportioned between the freight carrier and Amtrak for that reason?
There may, that's an excellent question, and I thought about it. I don't recall that, but that doesn't mean that we didn't do something at some point. I will say, I know the bulk of the infrastructure investment has always been from whichever public entity was required. And I think that's appropriate because, yes, there can be this incremental off-peak kind of improvement in the freight operation, but the freight operation is, if it were in such a state that we really needed to improve it, we would have been out investing ourselves, right? It's nice, but it's not something that we would have paid for to get, if that makes sense.
Well, the last thing you said is a thought that has occurred to me frequently since I've joined this board, and that is, if there are infrastructure improvements, where are the investments from the freight carriers for their freight benefit? That's an important question.
Yeah, and just to provide a little coda to that, while I was CEO at Norfolk Southern, we invested a lot of our own money in our infrastructure, using, as I mentioned, a lot of time, using almost every time the RTC model process, but in order to kind of, you know, enhance our reliability and streamline our train operations. So there was a lot of willingness for the freights, for NS anyway, to invest in their own infrastructure where it was required. And there are places, I think, where investments we made around Roanoke would be one of them, where later on, when passenger service showed up, it reduced the need in that particular area of Roanoke for further investment to facilitate passenger operation. So it's not the freight railroads, in my experience, and my experience is NS, but also looking at the others, are very willing to invest in the lines where their performance is not adequate. And we were. But when the passenger operations come along, if there's some tangential improvement that's just really great, maybe the freight would participate, but that wouldn't be the expectation.
All right. Thank you very much.
Certainly.
Again, I think we all have benefited from your experience and insight. If there are any other follow-up questions for Wick, if not, we'll thank him for his time and willingness to participate. And you may get called on again for some insight.
I'm always happy to help. Thank you so much, everyone.
Really, thank you. Much appreciated.
Okay, take care. Bye.
So at this time, I understand that one of yesterday's speakers, John James from All Aboard Arizona, is available. So we're going to switch to him. But I also want to alert the listener that there is a phone number which we do not recognize showing up as a participant. If this is from a person who was one of yesterday's speakers and you can hear me, would you please email the board at hearings, HEARINGS, at stb.gov and tell us who you are and if you still want to speak so we can accommodate you. At this point, I'm going to go out of order to accommodate Mr. James from yesterday's schedule. If he's here, I am told you're here, Mr. James. Yes, no, maybe?
Yes, sir, I am.
There
Sorry.
you are. All right. You're on, sir.
I have been having technical problems this morning, mostly with internet connections from the great state of Arizona. I don't know why. It always seems to act up when you need it most, and I'm sure we've all experienced that.
No explanation necessary. We all have the same problem. Go right ahead.
Appreciate it, sir. I'm a member of an advocacy group called All Aboard Arizona. We're very focused on promoting and getting passenger service in the great state of Arizona. Our biggest challenge here is large distances and transportation corridors that are overflowing with capacity when it comes to the current alternatives. I'm interested in this particular situation today because All Aboard Arizona asked me to speak about this particular condition, this particular situation between Mobile and New Orleans. But I suppose I wouldn't be able to add anything special or out of the ordinary compared to the kind of folks that have already been speaking to the board, especially after Mr. Moorman. So I decided I would take a citizen's approach to this particular hearing. And that basically focuses on this basic concept. The position that I have personally is that I know that passenger rail service is a huge economic shot in the arm, if you will, for the communities that are served on that particular route. And for CSX, I would think it's a good PR move for them to encourage people to use passenger rail on their lines. The fact is that if it is an improving economic impact for the customers they serve, then that would indirectly or directly improve their customer base and business base for the services they offer when it comes to freight. I have to tell you that out here in the West, we see absolutely gigantic freight trains. I measure them between Yuma and Gila Bend, Arizona, and most of them are 2 to 2.5 miles long with multiple engines, even now something that I've never really noticed before, but engines in the middle of a freight train. These are gigantic machines. Yet we're talking about a passenger train, which relatively speaking in comparison is much lighter, I think a little bit more nimble, a little bit more quick to move through the systems. And I suppose the only real comment I have is that a large corporation that has had many years of experience in scheduling and handling its own freight operations should not necessarily have any challenges when it comes to scheduling in what is relatively a small train, a light train, a fast-moving train, so that it can provide the services to the citizens of the United States. More importantly, I think the expansion of scheduling, making more opportunity for Amtrak to provide passenger service, improves its ability to make it more viable for all passengers. If I may, before I close, I want to share with you, I'm a broadcast television engineer. I do mostly television sports. And I had a chance 2 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, to go to Houston to do, I believe it was college football. And at the time, I was very concerned about flying. We did not have a lot of knowledge at the time as to what exposure risks there were when you were flying. So I asked my employer to take me on the train, and they said, absolutely, we'd be happy to take you on the train. The problem was the schedule did not allow for me to economically get to Houston from Arizona. The schedule only allowed me to get there a day early and or return home a day later. And the client did not want to pay for the extra hotel room nights. And so I lost the job. It's a funny little thing, but it seems to me that more viability, more scheduling opportunities for passengers is a good thing for the system in total. And I certainly endorse Amtrak's position in expanding operations along this important corridor. I appreciate the chance to visit, and I hope that I've added a little something, a different point of view from all the fine people who have been speaking to the board this morning.
Mr. James, every one of you who has spoken to us has added something to our knowledge-based excitement, and we certainly appreciate your taking the time. Are there any questions for Mr. James? All right, sir. Thank you very much, and we're glad you were able to work out your internet so you can join us.
Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much.
All righty. So we're now going to go back to the panel, and I meant to alert everybody at the outset that it is my plan when the panel 11 is completed to break for approximately a half an hour. We have some business that we have to attend to. And then we'll get back to hearing from panel 12, and we will probably take a somewhat longer break after panel 12 before we start the pre-trial. So I just want to give a heads up to those participants. We'll see where we are in the morning. So let us go back now to panel 11. Our next speaker is Drake from Virginia. Ms. Drake.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you. I'm Thelma Drake. I'm a former member of Congress from Virginia's 2nd District, which includes Norfolk. While there, I served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I have also served in the Virginia House of Delegates. I've served as the director of the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and as an assistant director of public works in the transportation division for the city of Norfolk. You've heard a little bit about what we've done from Mr. Moorman, but I was director 2010 to 2014. We expanded Virginia Railway Express into Spotsylvania. We started the new Amtrak service that you heard about to Norfolk. Mr. Moorman was on our inaugural train. And because of his help, we were able to bring that service up in 2 years' time. We also entered into an agreement to expand intercity rail services to Roanoke. And during this time, our Virginia General Assembly created the Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund to support the expansion of this intercity rail and to fund projects needed to grow freight. Working with CSX and Norfolk Southern, for example, we worked to successfully return that service for the first time since 1977. It was quite an important day in Norfolk that day. This project included state-funded improvements to both CSX and Norfolk Southern rail facilities for the initiation of one train and the capacity to add 2 additional trains over a 10-year period. We were ranked number 3 as best performing state-sponsored service in the entire Amtrak system. During this time, Virginia initiated new rail services to new or previously abandoned Amtrak served markets by making investments in the freight rail facilities prior to the implementation of Section 209 of PREA. In 2013, Virginia entered into an agreement with Amtrak for the funding support for 5 legacy regional train services. This success in Virginia was because of careful planning and study, collaboration, and a partnership with our railroads. Virginia's passenger rail uses existing freight corridors. Commingled rail traffic presents unique operational challenges and safety concerns. Virginia developed robust framework agreements with CSX and Norfolk Southern that facilitated the development of commuter and intercity passenger rail. We found that the rail traffic controller is the best tool for studying existing and proposed rail operations to determine what infrastructure investments are necessary to support desired changes. It is standard practice to use RTC to study rail operations on congested, complex corridors. This is especially true when a corridor, when a corridor is on a congested, complex area. This is especially true when it experiences high variability in train run times and other performance metrics. The Department of Rail and Public Transportation utilized the RTC for studies of current and future freight operations when planning any new passenger service. An RTC study enabled us to protect the current and future viability of the entire rail network, both current and future freight and passenger service. Virginia's goal was to ensure reliable passenger service that commingles safely and efficiently with freight traffic to provide sufficient infrastructure to support both services and to fund and construct that infrastructure prior to introducing or expanding services. An RTC study provided the information necessary to determine what, if any, infrastructure is needed to support a given service project. In Virginia, we are very aware and respectful that the rail lines are freight lines and railroads make their income from moving freight. Both CSX and Norfolk Southern were willing to partner with us, work together, and through the studies to develop a system that met the needs of both freight operations and passenger movement. The freight railroads engaged in good faith and worked hard to find collaborative solutions. During the development of Virginia's rail programs, our partnership with CSX included the National Gateway Freight Intermodal Corridor, expansions of commuter rail, and the initiation of a new intercity passenger rail. We found that the RTC control was an analytic tool that respected by both CSX and the public agency to identify choke points and benefits of capacity improvements. It's my experience engaging with CSX. I found that CSX has always recognized that collaborative study and solutions-oriented engagement with all stakeholders impacted by potential product is the only way to ensure the success of rail project. My concern is that a decision to advance passenger rail service without the RTC will set a precedent for all future passenger rail projects and not achieve the results that the current studies, partnerships, and collaboration generate. I thank you for your time and I'm happy to answer any questions. Wait.
Thank you very much, Ms. Drake. Appreciate your particular insight and experience in this area. Are there any questions for Ms. Drake? Okay.
I got a quick one.
I'm sorry, Robert, go ahead.
If you don't mind. Thank you, Ms. Drake. And I do remember you from your time on the committee. My former boss, Mike Capuano, also served around the same time. Just a quick question in terms of your views on the importance of passenger rail and also the need to grow that within the state of Virginia. Can you just comment on the importance and the success of that?
Oh, it's been an incredible success in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as you heard from Mr. Moorman, starting with Lynchburg, moving to Norfolk. And one of the things that I did while there is signed the agreement for the service to go to Roanoke. And now they are working with the new rail authority to go beyond that and hopefully as far as Bristol. It's incredibly important, and local governments want it. Their concern, of course, was always how to pay for it. And local governments would think that we were going to look to them and ask them to pay for the operations, which we didn't do in Virginia. We created a fund, Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund, through the General Assembly in 2013. Well, we created it in 2011 and funded it in 2013 to help pay for those operating costs and the improvement cost. What was so critical to us was Norfolk Southern and CSX, and always amazed me that here we are getting in their way of running their freight services, and we're asking them to put passenger in the middle of it, but it has worked very effectively. And for us was interesting because it was one service out of Norfolk, one service going up the 95 corridor, and what we built in between to connect those two services, and they allowed us to do that. So I do think they act in good faith.
Thank you.
I just want to echo your and Robert's remarks and appreciate very much learning more about the model in Virginia. Thanks very much, Ms. Drake, for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other board member questions? All right, Ms. Drake, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time. All righty. Our next speaker is Alex Ayers, Family Business Coalition. Mr. Ayers.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Alex Ayers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Family Business Coalition. So my group represents a diverse collection of organizations. We're talking about protecting family businesses across America. It is really our goal to serve as the voice of family businesses across the country as an aid to improving job growth. We see family businesses as the backbone of the economy and using them to create a stronger climate for American business. So it's in our support of our core message that I'm here to voice our concerns about the proposal that you're considering relating to Amtrak's plan to expand passenger rail service along the Gulf Coast. It's given the fragile state of our current American supply chain and the economic recovery from the coronavirus that I don't think this is the right time that we can afford to make this decision. On the surface, it may not seem like it's a major undertaking to add just a few trains to the rail lines that already exist along the Gulf Coast from Mobile to New Orleans. But to anyone who has any understanding of the critical role freight rail plays in our global supply chain, and perhaps just as importantly for those small businesses like our members that rely on freight rail network to supply either their outgoing or incoming shipments, it's clear that what's being suggested is a major undertaking that could very easily weaken our transportation infrastructure. I want to point out that I am not here as an opponent to passenger rail, just as someone who views this as something that's being offered at the wrong time and definitely in the wrong place. Key questions remain unanswered even at this late stage of planning. And so after literally years of being in development, we must take a look, for instance, at the issues of ridership. We still don't know how to project how many riders this route will attract. In fact, the last public analysis I could find on the issue was all the way back in 2015, where it was said that Amtrak anticipated that this new service would handle less than 30 riders per trip. That was before Amtrak's president testified before Congress during the pandemic that the coronavirus had slashed ridership system-wide to 70% of its pre-pandemic levels. So while that 70% reduction is in no means going to continue post-pandemic, we don't know that the amount of ridership will increase to that same level that was predicted back in 2015. So are we supposed to believe that this proposed route, which at its loftiest estimates offered years, before anyone had even heard of the idea of COVID-19, will attract even a fraction of the ridership it initially suggested. Also, we have no idea what the total impact of business along the line will be. Our members are very concerned about being able to get their products on time to either their destination or to themselves. So, with the published study that shows adding passenger rail service between New Orleans and Mobile without additional infrastructure will cause significant harm to freight service, it's something that's very concerning to us. And so, while Amtrak, which receives almost all its funding from the federal government, as opposed to freight rail operators, which receive none, they're asking to move forward with starting new service without themselves even paying any of the needed infrastructure improvements that would allay any of these possible supply chain issues. So for me and my organization, these questions have to be answered in order for this project to move forward in a manner that we believe we're comfortable with. You wouldn't allow a private contractor to proceed with a major infrastructure project without this kind of due diligence. And we shouldn't allow a taxpayer-funded entity such as Amtrak to do so either. In fact, given that taxpayers are going to foot the bill for much of what's proposed, it seems that we need, to me, that the only fair way to do this is to have total transparency into what's at stake. It's simple fiscal responsibility, not an unreasonable request. More practically speaking, as someone who works closely with lots of businesses and organizations around the country, the efficiency of freight rail is something you can count on to get the job done. And when you're working hard to make ends meet, make a dollar, or create more opportunity for your employees, every delay matters. This was true before the pandemic, and with today's supply chain stretched to levels that we have never seen before, this is even more relevant now. I believe that Amtrak's project will make it harder for railroads in this region to deliver freight on time, and I think this erosion of reliability will be felt across the region's economy, and if you do greenlight this proposal, the precedent made would have a reverberating effect on other parts of the country. Amtrak has been very public about their lofty goals to expand passenger service elsewhere. In this case, we have data that says there will be a negative impact for freight rail, and we anticipate very low ridership on this passenger proposed project. What is to stop Amtrak from taking the new loose standard of harm on a new route can cause and push that to create new passenger rail service elsewhere, regardless of the negative effects? I have big hopes for 2022 expanding business, remedying the supply chain challenges, and steadfastly recovering from the pandemic, both physically and financially. So on behalf of the employees and partners that make up the Family Business Coalition, I thank you again for allowing me to share what is at stake with this decision, and I greatly appreciate this opportunity.
Mr. Harris, thank you for that presentation. I have a couple of questions. When you referred to the data, you said we have data concerning what would happen with the institution of passenger rail. Are you referring to the data that has been supplied by the parties in this case, or some other data that you have access to?
Some public data that we found back in 2015. I can go back and find that study and make it available to you all.
Yeah, no, that's okay, because we have a record that we have to preserve here, because this is a hearing on the record. I was just wondering whether you were referring to the RTC studies that have been submitted in this case or something else.
I believe it is something else. I'm not positive about the studies that have been submitted in this record.
All right. And the other question I had was, are there any of your business members or affiliates with your organization who are actually served by the freight on service on this particular line? Or were you talking to us more generally about the issues that your members have?
We're speaking more generally, but we do have distributors across the South that rely on both the rail system, bringing things from the port, along with additional intermodal facilities that move it to trucks to get the final kind of last mile delivery.
All right. Okay. Any other board members have any questions for Mr. Ayers? All right, sir. Thank you very much. Appreciate your participation. Before I go to the next speaker, I wanted to alert everyone as to whether they have any slides to show us. If they do, I should have said this at the outset, you have to let us know so our IT experts can arrange to have those shown. So please let us know if there are slides that you wanted to show us. Let us move forward. Our next speaker is Ray Chambers.
Hello, I am Ray Chambers, the Association of Innovative Passenger Rail Operations, or AIPRO. We are a nonprofit organization composed of independent passenger railroads and also labor. We are dedicated to advancing passenger rail operations in North America. We agree with the position of Senator Roger Wicker that there are major benefits that will be derived from reestablishing passenger rail service along the Gulf Coast. However, we do not take a specific position on the Amtrak petition. Rather, like several others, our testimony today simply puts forward a policy proposal promoting competition in the selection of operators for passenger corridors, which are subsidized by the states. This process will drive down project costs and will introduce innovative operations and permit the introduction of service at the earliest possible time. And we believe that the Gulf Coast is a good place to start. And in defense of this competition agenda, I offer 6 points. The first point is that the huge IIJA opportunity for intercity passenger rail is beyond the capability of any one company to fulfill. The Biden administration and the bipartisan infrastructure billions have created enormous potential. Neither Amtrak nor any other single company has the capability to achieve the goal of creating a high-performance intercity network. This will take on a full-on effort by states, local authorities, Amtrak, private passenger rail operators represented by AIPRO, host railroads, and labor. 2, the federal statutes explicitly authorize competition on intercity routes. The Congress ended Amtrak's statutory monopoly in 1997. Since that time, there have been a plethora of provisions that sanction competition on the intercity corridors. Many of them, interestingly enough, were sponsored by Senator Wicker. And in my submitted testimony and in note, I list all of those authorizations for competition. 3, there is sufficient federal funding now available to the states and the commissions to initiate competitive operations. If you look at just the $65 billion for intercity passenger rail, there's at least past $12 billion, and we think a lot more, that's available in discretionary grants to the states and commissions where they have equal access to this money. And the IIJA, as I just noticed, specifically authorizes teaming with independent operators and host railroads to provide innovative alternative services. 4, the independent operators that we represent in the AIPRO can do the job. Together we run streetcars, commuter rail, intercity trains, high-speed rail. In the United States and around the world, we move billions of passengers. The individual companies singly and together exceed that of Amtrak in terms of the movement of trains and passengers. We provide a wealth of innovative experience on a global basis. And we believe that our member AIPRO companies individually would have the interest and the capacity to bid on the Gulf Coast service with some innovative solutions that will produce excellent and efficient service. 5, the regulatory enforcement of passenger metrics and standards is a broken model in our view, and we need something new. While the present system of mandatory track access has been a field day for consultants and lawyers, it has largely failed, and the results are an ugly set of relationships that are often counterproductive. We submit there is an alternative based on commercial negotiations, that it is the commuter model that has worked well for our members across the nation, that the program should be centered on direct stakeholder negotiation, while the states will have the primary role, the states should have the primary role in these corridors that they support. We do not ask that the Amtrak statutory authority and mandates, the Amtrak mandates, be transferred to the states. This has failed to work and we need something new. Rather, there should be a new agreement between the states and the operators and the host railroads to settle disputes by arbitration overseen by the STB or FRA. And I think this conference is a good beginning on that discussion. 6, and lastly, the host railroads should become true partners in intercity passenger rail operations. I believe the exchange between Karen Hedlund and Wick Moorman as to how that took place successfully lays the groundwork. I think the win-win. It's exactly what we're talking about here. In addition to that, I believe the significant billions that have just been added by the IIJA grant funding are going to smooth the way to deals that can accommodate expanded passenger rail service as well as improve freight throughput. And remember that both of those are in the public interest. The competition to provide services will benefit the states, the host railroads, and create a vibrant market such as we have seen in Europe. And it will also benefit Amtrak, in our opinion. Amtrak will become a real operating marketplace competitor, and it'll solve a host of problems. In closing, we suggest that the Surface Transportation Board, with its responsibility for economic regulation, can contribute to the creation of a world-class urban and intercity rail network. We submit that the Gulf Coast has exciting potential, and it's a good place to start. We humbly suggest that the competition framework we're proposing is the future of passenger rail. I believe this hearing has been an important beginning into an important national discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers. Mentioning the word competition as always warms my heart in this arena. We obviously have to stay within our current statutory authority in dealing with the pending matter. But your ideas are thought-provoking, and I appreciate your taking the time to share them with us. Karen Hedlund has a question for you.
Thank you very much. And Ray, thank you so much for participating in this hearing. Do you have a view as to, in a competitive situation, should the sponsor engage in the competition and select an operator, and then have the operator along with them negotiate with the host railroad, or should the sponsors negotiate with the host railroad, and then when that's completed, do a competition for an operator?
Well, that's the key question. And we are actually starting a formal process, which does not have my board approval, but I hope that it will. And it's going to be a formal process where we are going to attempt to list the potential candidates. We'll be looking at the Amtrak Connexus map, and I've got conference calls today with several agencies around the country who want to sponsor passenger rail service, and we're going to list them in a preliminary group as to those that we think are applicable for competition. The question that you're asking is, how do we go about then trying to get answers? How do we try to see whether these can work quickly? And my own view, which is open to discussion, and again, this is my own view, but in this process that we're creating, I expect that we will have a series of what we call market soundings. And in the market soundings, we'll feel out the host railroads, the sponsoring agencies, labor, as to what is the correct process to come forward with some sort of a competitive proposal that really works, that's state of the art. So the answer is yes. I think that we'll have a process. In my view, again, a lot of this will start with informal conversations between, we'll look at what you might call the sponsors or the commissions or whatever, but I think we might have some intense conversations between our members in setting up a competitive situation, but start maybe initially with the host railroads to see kind of what might work, what kind of improvements there might be together. And if there's something that generally seems to work, then you take it to the commission or the state, and then we put together the proposal, and we go to the FRA, and seek whatever the federal funding component is in all of this. So yes, your question is absolutely key. We're working on it, but we do have an idea, and I will be glad, since it's policy, I guess I can send you guys stuff, and I'll be glad to keep you informed as we develop this, what we call the list.
Thank you very much.
That would be very helpful. Patrick, you have a question?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Ray, very much for your insightful comments as always. You mentioned, and in response to Karen's question, you elaborated on discussions with host railroads. I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more information on the status of your discussions, sort of nationwide or in target routes with host railroads, but also with labor and the folks that may operate the routes.
Okay, let me hit labor first. Labor's key. I've worked on this business for years and years and years. I've been against labor and I've been with labor. And when I'm with labor, I do much better in the United States Congress. And really, the labor unions are critical to the kinds of good jobs we produce. There will be nothing that comes out of our organization that does not have some support from rail labor. We have on our board of directors the Maintenance Away and the BRS, which are the most involved non-ops in the kind of construction that's going to take place. And so they're a key factor. So then the next question is, and I've got to be a little bit, let me think about this for a second, in terms of, we have been reaching out around the country very informally. We have something we call market soundings. We've had a number of them over the years, which are fairly formal procedures. They're under non-disclosure agreements so that we can have really candid conversations about how this might work. All I can say about it is that we've had 3 or 4 state directors or joint power authority directors in the market soundings. We've had several, 2 host railroads to talk about, can all this be done and how can it be done? So we're trying to put together a process. There may be a whole series more of them, but I'll be glad to provide you, again, I got to get some board approval. There have been informal conversations that have taken place between my companies like Herzog and Transdev and others with the host railroads on how this might work. But yes, it's all going to be part of a process moving forward. We'll be glad to discuss it with you in any detail you might like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can't hear Marty.
I'm sorry.
Marty, you might be on mute.
I thought I left you speechless.
Well, that's never happened in the last 76 years. So
Well, it hadn't happened with me either. But
be a first. Thank you, Mr. Chambers. Really, very, very insightful and worthy comments. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Theodore Stalnos of the Calumet Area Industrial Commission. Mr. Stalnos. And
good morning.
Is the Calumet area my Calumet area in Chicago that you represent?
Yes,
Right.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Chicagoan. I'm speaking to you from the Pullman community.
Oh, very good.
Our south side. So,
all right,
thank you.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Ted Stalnos. I am the president of the Calumet Area Industrial Commission. Our mission is to support healthy industrial growth, employee training, and job creation in this region to benefit the rest of the country. I have worked as a union leader in the steel industry and have led organizations. Mission it is to help people, communities, and businesses. The Calumet region extends from Northwest Indiana through the south and southwest suburbs and the city of Chicago. We are reliant here on a resilient supply chain for our automotive plants, other manufacturing industries, and port interests. What happens at key interchanges in Chicago, Memphis, St. Louis, New Orleans matters to us here in the Calumet region. We believe that with the right investments, passenger and freight rail can be successful in their operations. We are not against passenger rail. In fact, the Calumet Area Industrial Commission has been a consistent supporter of the CREATE program here in Chicago, which I'm sure Mr. Oberman is very familiar with where planning, engineering, and construction of projects have allowed Chicago's 700 daily passenger trains and 500 daily freight trains to be #1 in North America for freight rail volumes while still expanding passenger rail here. It's been very successful working in harmony with each other. Amtrak has been a big beneficiary of this program. In fact, as I'm speaking to you here in the heart of Pullman neighborhood, which we were among many to support the development of a new national park where George Pullman built his rail car empire, where passenger rail is really the heart of it started. Few places on a national map are more representative of passenger rail in this country than where I'm speaking from now. But Amtrak's request for immediate access to freight rail in the Gulf zone, or anywhere for that matter, puts the supply chain at great risk. Not just the freight rail industry, but end users, intermodal terminals, ports, and of course, manufacturers. It is a 180-degree opposite method of the CREATE planning process, which is forged with the partnership of government, freight, and passenger rail. The Calumet region is served by 6 of the 7 Class 1 railroads, including direct routes to the Gulf region. There are ports in Northwest Indiana and Port of Illinois, which is I can see right outside my window from where I'm sitting, and they link to the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Montgomery, and Gulfport. Whether you're at our Ford assembly plant or our concrete plants, all have faced hiring and labor challenges that have caused disruptions in their operations. Of all the times that I can recall in my long career, now would be one of the most risky times to force access into the supply chain without a final agreement or study at such an important interchange. Again, we appreciate the mission of the Surface Transportation Board that promotes necessary redundancies for a fluid national transportation network, which is so important to us here on the south side of Chicago. What is done in the Gulfport truly affects us here. I truly hear about it from my members, my board of directors, and I thank you for your time today to address this hearing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stahl. Much appreciated. Are you involved at all with Joe Zavo and the Pullman organization?
Yes, I've sat on the Historic Pullman Foundation board for about 7 years, and I asked Joe to, he asked me what would I like to do next. I said, find me a replacement. So I transitioned off. I served for 7 years. In fact, my next, my March luncheon will be at the Historic Pullman exhibit hall. I grew up in the West Pullman neighborhood, so I'm very, very, very familiar with it. And I live in, I didn't move far. I live in the 10th ward now in Hegewisch. So, and by the way, I am a serious promoter of Amtrak. I've taken it many times myself. Take the CTA. It's on my Facebook page, and I promote both.
Good. Don't leave out Metro.
I make sure to post it on there that I leave the car at home once in a while. So it's important. I'm a great supporter of that. So I'll jump on the South Shore also, but I don't want to see my Ford plant shut down because it's missing supplies, and the same with the concrete plants for Ozinga and other key employers that we have here, or the port missing things. So what happens down in New Orleans is key to what will happen here in Chicago, Northwest Indiana, and the south suburbs.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Stalnos? All right. Thank you very much, sir.
I have one, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry, Karen.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Stamas. I also grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I am very, very familiar with the Calumet region. And one thing that Chicago has always done well is planning, as the great Daniel Burnham once said, make no little plans, for they have no magic to stir the hearts of men, or words to that effect. And in terms of rail, of course, the CREATE efforts have been quite extraordinary. And I know that when I was at FRA, we did a lot of work, which continues today, on the south of the lake area, seeking to enhance passenger rail and speed up passenger rail through that area. My question for you is, I mean, are you familiar with the years of planning that have gone into studying the Gulf Coast situation?
I'm somewhat familiar that studies have been done, but when I hear about freight rail at this time being interrupted, when I know the supply chain problems that we're having around the country, that makes me very, very leery, because we're having, not only at the Ford plant, which is, it blocks from my home, where we're having thousands of people laid off, and it's not just for the chip problem that we have, but there's so many different issues that can affect an automobile supply chain. But everything from water meters and other things, that unbelievable what's being held up in the supply chain right now that's coming through the Gulf Coast that I'm hearing from our members. I get very, very uptight about what can affect here in Chicago, and what I hear from the port system. So when I'm hearing about freight rail being disrupted at all at this critical time, it's just a strong concern of mine, or anywhere in it, whether it's in St. Louis or anywhere. It's just a large concern to me and my members. We want to keep people in Pullman and Hegewisch working, and in Highland, Indiana, and other places in Kankakee.
All right, any further questions? All right, thank you again, Mr. Stanos, much appreciated.
Okay, salute to the north side.
We're still here. Thank you. Our next speaker is Timothy Lee.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Great, thanks. Well, I've got in-laws from the south side of Chicago, so and I'm a fourth generation railroading family member, so this is certainly something that touches my heart as well. My name is Timothy Lee. I'm Senior Vice President of Legal and Public Affairs at the Center for Individual Freedom, which has about 300,000 members and supporters and activists across the country, including Louisiana and Alabama. We were founded in 1998 to safeguard the principles of free markets and the rule of law, and that includes good governance and sound fiscal policy, which is one reason I'm speaking today. And I appreciate this opportunity. We've also at CFIF discussed funding and operations of Amtrak throughout our history. So our belief that America's fragile supply chain warrants additional attention in today's landscape makes us eager to offer this perspective. CFIF's position is simple. We shouldn't rush into this, and I think a lot of the testimony you've heard from people with skin in the game, whose bottom lines are affected by this, sort of confirms what I'm about to say. There are four overarching reasons that we want to speak on this issue. Number one, the lack of due process and empirical study that would confirm the fairness and efficiency of this proposal. Number two, the cost to taxpayers. Number three, as we heard just a moment ago and throughout the last couple of days, supply chain disruptions due to the effect on freight rail. And finally, the negative precedent that this would set going forward. So first of all, speaking with regard to empirical studies, as other people have mentioned and is readily available for anybody in the public wanting to look into this, the studies don't confirm that this is a wise maneuver to follow Amtrak's proposal. The last public study was 2015. This is from Amtrak itself, and this is all part of the record, easily searchable to anybody. That accounted 38,400 passengers, which would be 26 riders per trip. And as others have also said, in recent days, Amtrak President Stephen Gardner told Congress that ridership won't even reach those levels for years to come. They estimated about 70% right now. That would mean 18 riders per trip. And so we don't think that justifies, in a cost-benefit scenario, the proposal. Number two, the cost. It's important to note that Amtrak, as an individual entity, won't pay this bill. Rather, it'll be paid by the public and private parties, in addition to taxpayer billions that have already been required by Amtrak. CFIF has again written extensively on this in the past. Third, the supply chain disruptions, and there's little that I can add in addition to people that have skin in the game and whose businesses are on the line. But we would add that this proposal challenges freight railroads, which are already operating in the area, which adds another dynamic to the supply chain issues that we're all facing throughout the country, but specifically in those areas as well. This would eat into margins for businesses, as they've said themselves. I would note that a lot of the people who are criticizing some of the private entities speaking on this issue aren't the ones with skin in the game. They like to tell CSX or other private entities how they could best run their business. But it's easy to say, but it's harder to do when they're the ones with actual skin in the game. Finally, just the lack of ridership, the cost and the impact on the supply chain means that this is a bad precedent if Amtrak's proposal and they receive this as a favorable vote from the board as a blessing to extend this new precedent into other markets around the US. We think that's a terrible precedent going forward, especially as we've said before with all the supply chain disruptions. So I know I've gone a little bit over my time here, but we urge the STB to carefully and more soberly review these concerns and avoid the prospect of self-inflicted harm amid a precarious moment in America's economic recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you much, Mr. Lee, and no problems. Your exceeding your time limit was not a problem.
The Santa Fe Railroad privilege going back to my great-grandfather.
Yeah, well, I come from Metro where 6 minutes either way is allowable, and you were only 1.5, so you're fine.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Lee? All right, our next speaker is Daniel Savickas.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. So my name is Dan Savickas. I serve as Government Affairs Manager for the Taxpayers Protection Alliance and a frequent rider of Amtrak myself. I use it occasionally to commute from DC to visit my family in northern New Jersey. For TBA's part, we're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan taxpayer consumer advocacy org dedicated to educating the public through research, analysis, and dissemination of information on the government's effects on the economy. Amtrak already receives billions of dollars in funding from the federal government and thus the American taxpayer. That's because a vast majority of Amtrak's lines are unprofitable. And in fact, recent analyses show only lines in the Northeast corridor connecting Washington, D.C. and Boston run at an actual profit. The rest typically require subsidies ranging anywhere from $81 to a whopping $417 per passenger, and American taxpayers bear that burden. The proposed line from Mobile to New Orleans will almost certainly yield similar results. A 2015 Amtrak analysis on such a route has shown the proposed line would lose roughly $4 million annually, while drawing only a paltry 26 passengers per trip. It's important to note that the financial losses for the service is likely much higher today, given rampant inflation and the detrimental effect that the coronavirus pandemic has had on ridership habits. It's safe to assume there will be fewer riders and thus more required subsidies coming from the American taxpayer. In the years since that public report, Amtrak has also failed to provide any evidence that there is sufficient demand for such a passenger route. Driving along I-10 between the two cities does not take more than a few hours. Additionally, there exist bus routes from companies like Megabus and Greyhound that can complete that trip for far less cost to consumers and taxpayers than Amtrak would. And while there are no direct flights currently between the two cities for an even shorter trip, both cities have the airport infrastructure in place to change that reality if, in fact, there is demand for it. In fact, the existing Amtrak routes in the Gulf Coast have already demonstrated lack of demand. Mississippi currently has a number of routes connecting New Orleans, New York, and Chicago. From 2011 to 2019, ridership in Mississippi along these routes increased by less than 5%, lagging far behind the state's overall growth in income. Cost and the potential for train delays show that consumers in the area do not find Amtrak to be a suitable option for them. The precedent set by allowing this expansion to go forward is potentially devastating for freight rail in the US. According to a more recently completed impact study, this route would cause severe disruptions to the supply chain along the Gulf Coast, adding to the disruptions that have already taken place due to the global pandemic and the economic restrictions that are tied to it. Without significant changes, Amtrak routes would disrupt freight rail lines and cause delays and congestion, only exacerbating the issues that we're already seeing play out globally. If Amtrak is allowed to move forward without making necessary improvements, it will set the precedent that they may start new services and routes across the nation without first ensuring the supply chain is not disrupted or demonstrating that there is any pent-up demand for the service in the first place. As an organization that's dedicated to protecting the interests of taxpayers and consumers across the nation, TPA is understandably concerned about this project because American taxpayers will bear the cost of the new service, subsidize the lack of ridership, and feel the pains of the supply chain disruptions that will result. We urge the board not to allow it to go forward until the necessary improvements are made and sufficient demand for such a route is demonstrated. I appreciate your time and for your patience in allowing me to go a few seconds over.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Savickas. I just have one question. Is it your organization's position that public transit should never be subsidized? It should only be instigated if it pays for itself?
We currently believe that subsidies should be at a bare minimum, and Lord willing, one day there will be no need for public subsidies of transit.
Well, and when you say transit, do you include, city buses and subways, things of that nature as well?
Again, in a perfect world, TPA would love to see all subsidies of public transit go away and have it be left to the private market.
Is it your organization's view that such a perfect world is attainable in the foreseeable future?
We've existed for a little over a decade right now, and we're working towards that goal in baby steps.
I admire your idealism. Are there any questions for Mr. Savickas? Karen.
I have one. Mr. Savickas, do you understand that STB plays no role in deciding whether this line should be funded?
Can't say that I understand the exact logistics of how this would play out. I'm expressing opposition in whatever way I can at this point. I appreciate the clarification.
Thank you.
All right. Any further questions for Mr. Savickas? Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Gerald Simeka. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Gerard Simeka? Yes.
Simeka. There you go.
How you doing?
Just had the accent grav in the wrong place. Go ahead, Mr. Simeka.
I don't think there's a consensus on how it's pronounced, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the board having me to express our comments. I am the co-founder and chairman of CASE, Consumer Action for a Strong Economy. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit free market-oriented consumer advocacy organization. And I'd just like to start our comments by saying as the STB considers the merits of Amtrak's proposed expansion of passenger rail service on the Gulf Coast, the project's potential impact on the region's existing freight rail network must be front and center. We are all aware the global supply chain is in the midst of considerable instability. Businesses large and small, families and communities nationwide witness this reality on a daily basis through empty store shelves, longer waits for goods and supplies, and of course, rising inflation. With these pressures mounting, we believe the board's focus should be on sound policy and support for investments that strengthen existing rail infrastructure in a manner that facilitates a more dependable and efficient supply chain. Amtrak's proposal would introduce significant additional pressures on the supply chain. And as we've heard from several other speakers, it was nearly 7 years ago when the last public report was released outlining passenger traffic estimates for this proposal. That analysis prior to the disruptions of the pandemic found the new service would mean at maximum an additional 26 rides per trip. And we further consider the December congressional testimony of Amtrak's President Gardner, who stated that ridership remains at only 70% of pre-pandemic levels and would take years to return. We question then, given the low volume on some of Amtrak's more popular lines, if a legitimate need even exists to push forward with this service right now. It's a question at the center of this. What we do know is that adding any new passenger trains, whether they're running a few dozen people a day or fewer, would burden host railroads operated by companies such as CSX and Norfolk Southern, dropping more traffic and congestion onto an already stressed network. The result would be a substantial reduction in key performance metrics like on-time delivery and speed. The disruption would create unwelcome and costly burdens on our railroads, but the pain would also be felt by countless businesses and consumers that depend on reliable freight rail. The issues of Amtrak's proposal are exacerbated by a lack of collaboration and joint planning with host railroads and communities along the route. On shared rail lines, deep integration and partnership are essential. Amtrak's failure to thoughtfully engage with other stakeholders sets a concerning precedent. At a minimum, the board should insist that Amtrak return to the negotiating table for more meaningful engagement with the many stakeholders impacted by their plan. Beyond being ill-timed and ill-defined, Amtrak's proposal is also financially concerning. Amtrak regularly operates at a loss and relies entirely on public funding by taxpayers to maintain its existing service. It took in billions in additional funding from the infrastructure bill passed through Congress last year as well. This total dependence on taxpayer money is not new, but the Gulf Coast proposal underscores the need for better stewardship of this funding. It is not clear, and in fact, it's quite unlikely that sufficient demand even exists for the Gulf Coast project. Given the pandemic's ongoing impact on public transportation, it is careless to embark on a massive capital investment with such disruptive implications without a far more thorough review of the impact on commercial and the consumer landscape. Finally, though the proposal in front of you is focused on the Gulf Coast, we are concerned that if the board allows Amtrak to proceed without addressing the glaring infrastructure needs and consequential negative impacts it would bring to the freight system in the Gulf, the board will have established a new relaxed precedent that Amtrak could apply elsewhere. Allowing passenger service with anemic interest and demand to take priority over critical freight networks is a dangerous and troubling new standard we would hope the board would avoid establishing. We believe that Amtrak should focus on improving its existing operations rather than spending even more to expand service of dubious need that subsequently requires private companies to negatively impact their own operations. As an organization focused on and committed to sound, responsible economic policy, we cannot support Amtrak's plan, and we strongly urge the members of the Surface Transportation Board to recognize the proposal's impacts on our economy, consumers, and the regional supply chain, and to reject the proposal in its current form. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Simica. Are there any questions from the board? All right. Thank you much for your thoughts and your contributions.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Virgil Payne. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Chairman Overman. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Yes, sir.
Great. My name is Virgil Payne. I want to outline an amicable, discernible metric as my personal opinion. I'm a professional engineer. I support high-volume manufacturing reliant on highway and railway logistics. Previously, I supported MDOT, coordinating highway projects. I-69 is an example, from design and construction to FHWA acceptance. And prior to that, I worked in railroad operations. So I want to give a perspective from both sides of the fence centered on true financial resource efficiency. I believe the board should clarify the minimum baseline fixed infrastructure first needed for freight transportation, and that would allow engineers to work, provide an amicable solution to find efficient infrastructure. It appears the most recent data submissions have diverged further from the publicly discernible test, yielding more questions, and ultimately citizens are being hindered from providing informed opinions to elected representatives without a macro level, not a fine level, but a macro level view towards railroad mainline performance. It's effectively allowing a veto to be inserted into the process outlined by public law that did not exist. Namely, absence of metrics similar to a highway minimum level of service, the mainline capacity models may never converge on an objective division. And this is important as you must have numerical functioning of the models from the baseline. Such a baseline metric might be an MLS of 40 to 60 daily average freight train minutes delay per 100 train miles, which has been discussed in many papers. This would be only for revenue adequate railroads with 15 million GT gross tons or more. And this would be a way to fungibly trade off between mainline capacity and terminal operations and really be able to evaluate that. Absent such a metric that you might set, what's to throttle future operations such that the public would simply pay for infrastructure that might have less disciplined operations, such as an extra hour to recrew trains on the main line. And while these analytical capacity models are helpful with new computers, I grew up with earlier capacity curves that were parametric of nature, and they actually demonstrate less freight train delays if we simply ran trains less with a lower, shorter length than they currently exist. So share my screen quickly. This is an old 1975 FRA document. It's important to note macro level data was given to produce this. And you can see by curve slope changes that you enter in a stable range when you get above a certain point that you allow in your model as your starting point. This is an important distinction we need to make, and granted, this is public data from 1975 in a different era when we had a lot more collaboration, so to speak. I did also want to speak about another one. We do need to have at least two fits in time. So you need to have perhaps a 2019 and a 2014 to really figure out how a changing system is working within the current, if it's actually true or not, essentially. So we need to also talk about unstable regions. The other part of my written testimony talks about in Figure 2, when you do have trains being operated at greater length and sidings, you actually enter into a very unstable region. And again, I grew up on pile curves and different things like that are parametric. This parametric curve helps to understand what we're talking about. You see right here, this red highlighted region is an unstable area. It's not a public good to be operating in this region. So this is a way to effectively set a discernible test for the board to consider. And as well, there's another way, and I'll talk about this in Figure 3 of my written testimony. There's a way to do a capacity utility curve, which is speed squared times the unit of movement, ton, mile, whatever not. And then you can actually go in and then set the same MLOS metric from that. It would provide defensible public rationale for what you might do. All that to be said, these are all really good ideas about how the board can actually allow engineers to work in an agreeable manner. Now, the other way to do this is simply to set a net present value for what the operational changes needed to operate shorter trains might be and convert that to capital as a conversion, right? So all this points to need for public scrutiny. I will have to say there is a need also for public investment in the general railroad system simply because interstate highways have a very high publicly funded financial gap between incremental fuel taxes and revenues and financial costs of construction, maintenance, and accidents. Higher than the HTA studies have presented, and I have actual reference in my paper, original research I actually did a 6-decade analysis, first ever that I can find. And so this is one of the things the board might understand. I would urge the board in this particular case to approve Amtrak's original request on their terms with the knowledge that the public is actually investing 95-some million. That's pretty close to what the FRA actually recommended as well. And they, of course, did a study as well, an analysis. And this would be a way to support smaller industry shippers, align timely passenger train operations, and increase interstate intermodal freight operations they're all actually an aligned goal. And I believe in this case, it's really true that they would promote greater resource and true financial efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. That was a very erudite presentation, and unfortunately, it surpassed some of my ability to understand the math. But I get the point, and I thought it was very, very helpful. I appreciate it. Are there any questions for Mr. Payne? All right. Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Alan Drake. Mr. Drake.
Good morning, and my apologies for not having video, but such as it is.
It's all right.
I may be the only unaffiliated person that lives in the service area speaking. I live in New Orleans, and I would like to speak to a life safety and a health issue that the Amtrak service would benefit. And you know, your decision is partially weighed on cost versus benefits. So I would like to elaborate on two benefits. One of those is that many of those who died or suffered immensely from the hurricanes Katrina and earlier Camille, were both on the Gulf Coast, were people that were unable to evacuate. They did not have access to a car, and oftentimes they were mobility impaired. With proper planning, New Orleans is an Amtrak depot, and additional cars and consets could be put together and pull out additional people from wherever the looming hurricane is expected to hit. Only New Orleans has made provisions, and they have made those unfortunately only after Katrina, for people that are mobility limited to evacuate in case of a hurricane. This service would have the potential to significantly improve this. And I can speak from personal knowledge that many people that lived through Hurricane Katrina, even though they lived, they were impacted for many years afterwards by the trauma of doing so. So there is a significant, probably measuring in the thousands of people, benefit to having this service that can be used for hurricane evacuation. And I think that that should be included in your benefits. The other one is that is access to premier medical services. Within a short streetcar ride from New Orleans UPT, we have both University Medical Center and across the street from it, a large VA medical center. University Medical is home to not one, but two medical schools, Tulane and LSU. And it provides a premier level of care that is unavailable anywhere else along the route. And for people that do not have easy access to a car, and that includes many people whose illnesses prevent them from driving, this service could provide them access to medical care that would not otherwise be available. It's my understanding that the VA hospital provides cancer service for a multi-state area for veterans that have cancer, for example. So this is a benefit to the entire population that lives along this route for those that do not have easy access to a car. Even if they can drive today, a future illness may prevent them from driving when they need premier level care. You know, those are, any questions?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Drake. Do any board members have questions for Mr. Drake? All right. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance and appreciate your comments. All right. We will next go to Patrick Cagle.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Cagle, and I'm president of the Alabama Mining Association. I was also born in Mobile, and the Gulf Coast is near and dear to my heart. I want to thank the Surface Transportation Board for the opportunity to express our concerns with you regarding Amtrak's proposed Gulf Coast passenger rail service between New Orleans and Mobile. The Alabama Mining Association is a 501c6 nonprofit trade association located in Montgomery, Alabama. Our organization represents all types of mining operations in Alabama, but my comments here today are specifically related to our members who mine metallurgical coal, which is often referred to as met coal. Before I tell you what met coal is, let me first tell you what it's not. It's not the thermal coal, sometimes called steam coal, that's burned to make electricity. While thermal coal plays an important role in a diversified energy portfolio of power generating resources, the reality is the demand for thermal coal is currently declining and will continue to do so in the future. Now that I've told you what it's not, let me tell you about metallurgical coal. Metallurgical coal is less abundant both domestically and globally than thermal coal, and it's a required input for primary steel production. Steelmakers around the world seek out Alabama's high-quality metallurgical coal, and its demand is expected to increase in coming years. Members of the Alabama Mining Association produce and ship on average an average of 11 million short tons of metallurgical coal through the Port of Mobile annually. According to a 2019 economic impact study commissioned by our association, the production and export of metallurgical coal has a $2 billion impact on Alabama's economy. And the mining of metallurgical coal supports thousands of very high-paying jobs. And I want to take a moment and set aside my notes and tell you, these aren't just numbers on paper. These are Alabama families, men and women who woke up and went to work today, working hard to produce metallurgical coal, load a unit train, and have no idea this hearing's going on. You know, I feel an enormous weight to be their advocate and their voice, to make clear that these, again, are not jobs on paper. These are livelihoods that can be impacted here. The Alabama Mining Association members rely on McDuffie Coal Terminal located at the Port of Mobile to remain competitive in a global commodities industry. A key competitive advantage for Alabama's metallurgical coal producers is their ability to transport their products quickly and cost effectively to the port using both freight rail and inland waterway. Over-reliance on just one method of transporting metallurgical coal to the Port of Mobile would add delays and increased costs, making it more difficult for Alabama companies to compete against foreign competitors. The Alabama Mining Association does not oppose Gulf Coast passenger rail service and expresses no opinion on the merits of that service. However, it's important that the introduction of passenger service does not decrease the quality of freight service provided by freight rail carriers that use the CSX corridor to access the seaport. It's unfair for Amtrak to insist on operating passenger rail service without regard to the businesses it will share the corridor with. If Amtrak's permitted to commence passenger service without analyzing the seaport's terminal railway utilization of the CSX corridor, or without paying its own way, the cost of adding the obviously needed infrastructure will inevitably fall on the shoulders of shippers, including our members. Much has been said about Amtrak's grants that would invest in the corridor. We encourage the board to explore that statement. Amtrak advised our elected officials that these funds would be used to improve passenger stations, platforms, and service or storage tracks to support passenger rail operations, not freight. These funds do nothing to secure the efficient freight mobility on a mostly single track corridor. I'd also like to address comments by passenger rail advocates hailing from across the country. While they mean well and are passionate about passenger rail, it struck me that that many do not fundamentally understand how bulk, overdimensional, and containerized products move in this country. Some also do not understand the Port of Mobile services distant parts of the country and even North America. I think it's worth noting in this proceeding what Mobile and the U.S. Gulf of Mexico seaports do for the U.S. economy. Half of our nation's total tonnage that moves through U.S. seaports and inland ports moves through Gulf of Mexico ports. This nation moved 2.5 billion tons of goods through ports in 2019, which is the last year of publicly available federal statistics published through the U.S. Waterborne Commerce Center's website. 1.25 billion tons of that volume moved through a U.S. Gulf port. Let me repeat this very important statistic. half of the 2.5 billion tons of U.S. commerce in 2019 moving through ports moved through a U.S. Gulf port. Of the top 20 largest seaports in the United States by volume, 12 of those ports are U.S. Gulf ports. The Port of Mobile is the 11th largest. This board has an obligation to protect the interest of all parties that rely on the national rail network, not just those of passenger rail. Amtrak's desire for access to the Gulf Coast corridor with no strings attached is not only harmful to freight rail service, but it's indefensible given the substantial funding Amtrak received from Congress last year. The Alabama Mining Association requests that this board deny Amtrak's petition as it stands and compel Amtrak to work with our seaport and the stakeholders to effect and fund the necessary improvements to ensure that both freight rail and passenger rail operate efficiently and cost effectively. I appreciate this opportunity to speak on this important matter on behalf of our members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cagle. We appreciate your effort here. And I noticed with envy your Peloton in the background, something I could probably use. So are there any questions for Mr. Cagle? All right, thank you very much. That concludes panel 11. We are going to take a recess, but before we do that, I want to make one last inquiry about people who were not able to be with us yesterday. Barney Bishop, is he available? Michael Hines and Julio Fuentes. All right. Well, that then concludes all of the panels up through panel 11. As I indicated earlier, we're going to take approximately we better be specific, a half an hour break at this point, and we will convene at noon Eastern with panel 12. At the conclusion of panel 12, I expect to take a little bit longer break that will allow us for lunch, probably 1 hour. We'll see how long panel 12 goes, and then we will reconvene for the pretrial conference part of this proceeding. So with that, we will recess. I will see you all in 31 minutes. All right. Are we ready to reconvene, Matt?
We are.
All right. So we are now at panel 12. The list of people who I have who are expected to be here for panel 12 are Jim Foote and Ray Atkins from CSX, Bill Mullins from NS, Robert Wimbush on behalf of the port, and Stephen Gardner and Jessica Amundsen, for Amtrak. Are everybody here?
Here, Jim Foote is here.
Hey, Jim.
How are you?
We meet again.
Yes, sir. Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Hello,
We
it's
are,
Mr. Chairman. I am.
There's Steve Gardner. Bill, you're here. Ray?
I'm here as well.
Ray, you're here? Okay.
I'm here as well.
All righty. Bob Wimbush?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon.
Bill Mullins is here.
Gotcha. And Jessica Amundsen?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm here. Thank you.
There you are. Thank you. Do you prefer to use your full middle name as well, or?
Amundsen is fine. Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It's just the way it was listed here. All right. So in order of presentation, I don't know if Ray and Jim, you want to just speak together. That's fine with us. I don't want to cut anybody off, and I want to hear everything that you feel you need to say to respond or comment on what has gone on before. But I do want to remind you all that we have at least 2 days. We're going to talk about that this afternoon, of trial set for March 9th and 10th, where everybody on this panel will be a full participant with ample opportunity to talk to us. So, and we have business to do this afternoon. So I don't know if we really have the need to respond to everything that happened, but I'm sure there's some things you want to tell us, and I think we all very much want to hear them. So with that, Jim, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, for the opportunity to share my views with you today. Let me begin with a simple and clear message. CSX is not against the introduction of new passenger rail service on the Gulf Coast. In fact, I am confident new service can be introduced, but it must be done in a safe and efficient manner, which will require sufficient infrastructure investment. To achieve this, there must be a partnership between Amtrak and the host railroads, with the support and input of key parties, including federal, state, and local governments, affected stakeholders, and communities. CSX hopes the board can help facilitate just such a partnership. I am urging the board to be a voice of reason here. Amtrak is seeking to force its way onto our rail lines without consideration of any of the impacts it would have on our existing and future customers and the local communities. There is a very real need for new infrastructure to accommodate Amtrak's proposed new passenger rail service that should not be ignored. Instead of working together as we have successfully done in the past, Amtrak has apparently decided it would be more politically advantageous to petition this board to require us to initiate service without first providing for needed infrastructure to accommodate new Gulf Coast service or to reach any agreement on the proposition. This case is about far more than just getting 20 to 40 people per trip from New Orleans to Mobile. It's about a new national agenda and Amtrak's desire to change the law and create a new roadmap for imposing new passenger service without working with host carriers or local communities to first add necessary capacity. It is hard to resolve a dispute when the other side has a different agenda. CSX would like nothing more than to reach an agreement with Amtrak rather than expending time and resources on litigation. Time and resources that would be better directed toward working together to initiate new service. As the board knows, CSX hosts passenger service all over our network. No other carrier handles more long-distance passenger service than CSX. But unlike anywhere else on our network involving passenger service, serious concerns have been brought to your attention from customers, short-line railroads, elected representatives, state agencies, and a variety of community interests. Stakeholders are rightly concerned, as are we. And you heard from concerned parties that represent areas beyond the Gulf Coast, including hundreds of customers that signed a petition or submitted letters expressing the concern that Amtrak's approach here of forcing itself on freight lines without addressing needed infrastructure to accommodate such expansion would be replicated across the country. Let me be clear. Amtrak is asking the board to require us to add 4 passenger trains daily, 28 additional trains weekly during peak hours onto a very busy corridor, one that navigates mostly single-line track and has 7 drawbridges between 2 important rail terminals, the Port of Mobile and New Orleans, without any consideration to the infrastructure that such new service necessitates. If Amtrak's approach prevails here, it will be at the expense of the nation's freight rail network and the customers who rely on us. I want to briefly describe to you what is going on in the freight rail network in the Gulf Coast. Mobile is a thriving and busy rail terminal. It is a marvel of growth and new opportunities and a cornerstone of the Alabama economic resurgence. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the port announced it will construct a new inland intermodal facility that CSX will serve. As for New Orleans, it is the 3rd largest rail gateway in America in volume. As I said, CSX knows from experience that passenger service can work in harmony with freight service. There is no reason that Amtrak and the host railroads here cannot find a workable way to add new passenger service over this line, even service between these 2 busy and growing terminals. To date, Amtrak has refused to commit to any additional infrastructure investments to accommodate its new service. Yet Amtrak is in an enviable position in that it could help address the infrastructure needs it requires, having recently received billions of dollars in the recent infrastructure bill, and there are billions of additional dollars that can apply to projects like this. One should be asking, what level of investment, if any, is Amtrak willing to provide to support its new service? Is this new service a priority for Amtrak or not? In my view, there is a right way and a wrong way to add new passenger service to a busy rail line. Virginia is a great example of the right and responsible way. CSX, Amtrak, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Virginia Railway Express all studied current freight and passenger operations as well as reasonably anticipated growth. With that background, we were then able to successfully reach an agreement that will lead to $3.9 billion in new infrastructure investment to help support that service. This new investment will provide for additional capacity constructed in both the Commonwealth and the District of Columbia. Through this negotiation, the parties were able to agree on how to bring new passenger trains online in a way that would not cause impairment to freight service. It is a perfect example of what is possible when all parties work together with a common objective. Amtrak's approach to service in the Gulf Coast, however, has been very different from the approach taken in Virginia. Amtrak officials here have not sought a collective solution and in some cases completely ignored the desires of local stakeholders. Amtrak's insistence for a station in downtown Mobile is a perfect example of this. You heard directly from the mayor of Mobile, the Mobile Airport Authority, Senator Shelby and Tuberville, and the entire Alabama congressional delegation, as well as members of the Southern Rail Commission, that the Brookley Field Commercial Airport just outside of downtown is the ideal location. The only one left insisting for a downtown location is Amtrak. Alabama stakeholders have also expressed concerns that they will ultimately have to pay for a new service that it doesn't want. In Louisiana, Senator John Kennedy and the Port of New Orleans have also expressed concerns about the proposal. A joint study by an independent consultant that Amtrak selected and hired had been underway that was supposed to address concerns such as those I just mentioned regarding the proposed new service. But in December 2020, during the study's final phase, Amtrak suddenly abandoned it. We even offered to pay for its completion. Amtrak has said it withdrew from the study because they didn't think enough information was being shared with them. But we did not withhold information. We provided all the information to Amtrak's consultant, which is a standard practice in board proceedings and one that Amtrak has followed many times. I also want to clarify another important point. It has been stated repeatedly during this hearing that the Gulf Coast has been without passenger service since 2005. After Hurricane Katrina, CSX spent over $300 million to repair the rail line in just 6 months. Since then, Amtrak has had the contractual right to restore the Sunset Limited service, but they never have. The new service that Amtrak is proposing is not a restoration of the Sunset Limited. That service was completely different from what is being proposed today. The Sunset Limited was 6 trains per week that ran in the middle of the night and had a schedule of almost 6 hours between New Orleans and Mobile before continuing on to Orlando. 6 trains per week is very different than what Amtrak is proposing today, with some 28 trains per week during peak times with a schedule of 3.5 hours. Nevertheless, I am trying to remain optimistic that together we can still find a responsible path forward. First, we have provided Amtrak and the board with a completed study supported by a number of experts who use the best modeling tools available. The study is complete. Everyone knows what needs to be done. Second, we've talked to everyone who has a stake in starting this new passenger service, including Amtrak, the port, and state and local community leaders. We believe we have a solution that will work for everyone. We've done everything in our power to get this resolved. The board knows that we are all capable of working collaboratively to find a balanced solution. If helpful, CSX would agree to participate in board-sponsored mediation to resolve as many issues as possible. But to get to a fair, balanced, and reasoned solution, one that takes into account the concerns of those who appeared before you during this hearing or submitted written comments, we ask the STB to exercise its independence and put an end to the extreme position being advanced by Amtrak. This is the only way we will reach a consensus that is agreeable to Amtrak, the host railroads, the Port of Mobile, our customers and interchange partners, and the citizens who will ultimately bear the cost of both the state-sponsored route and any harm to freight rail service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and board members, for your interest in this matter. Our nation's freight rail network is the envy of the world. It can continue to be so while growing and enhancing passenger traffic, but it requires a rational and balanced approach. You have my personal commitment to continue working towards a practical solution in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And I appreciate everything you said, and I am not going to limit any of the other speakers. And I did not want to interrupt you because I wanted you to present to us what you wanted to say this morning. But I think we all recognize that a number of issues that you raised are subject to ongoing parts of the actual litigation process we're going to hear on March 9th and 10th. And I imagine these are arguments that the lawyers are going to want to make, and we're going to have to make rulings on. And so I didn't, what I'm trying to articulate is that we're going to hear you for your impassioned plea as to how ultimately you would like to work with Amtrak. But a lot of the specifics, as you know, are disputed that you mentioned, and are matters that have to be determined by us in the litigation phase of this matter, which will really start during the pretrial after this session. So for what it's worth to the others, if you want to respond, we're not going to make any rulings or deal with the discovery issues and those things at this point. But I appreciate what you had to say about it. And Ray, I don't know if you want to add anything. I don't know if board members have questions for Jim or not. Ray, did you want to add anything?
No, Chairman Oberman, we had nothing further to add.
Okay. Are there questions for Jim from board members? Jim, I have a question that is not part necessarily of decision-making process, but you're here and I have been diligently perusing the record, and there are some aspects of the art, which I found in the RTC study, which I wanted to ask you to comment on, which I have found of concern in general. You know, and everybody in this hearing knows, that the board, and particularly me, I have been raising service issues involving CSX and NS specifically over the last few months, and we've had a lot of back and forth on that subject, and I hope progress is being made. A lot of it has to do with crew share. But I was struck by a paragraph, and I want to emphasize, I haven't made any decisions about this case, and I don't know that what I'm going to ask you is relevant to the outcome of this case, but it is relevant to our general issues about service in general on yours and everybody else's network. There's a description at page 19 of the RTC report. And I'm going to read it so I don't incorrectly paraphrase it. It's just a paragraph. CSX's Gentilly Yard is immediately to the east of the Industrial Canal. CSX traffic from the east and interchange traffic from New Orleans terminates at Gentilly Yard. The main line of the north and south end of Gentilly are often occupied by yard trains, blocking the main line when switching cars. Activities from these yard trains, Industrial Canal Bridge, and other mainline interchange activities can result in delays to the interchange traffic from NS. Interchange trains traveling from UP, BN, and CN often experience delays en route to Gentilly Yard, regularly resulting in multiple hours of mainline delays. That has nothing to do with Amtrak trains. And I look back today at the last 11 years, long since Katrina, CSX has paid the shareholders nearly $30 billion in stock buybacks and dividends. NS has paid nearly $27 billion. And I'm wondering that if Amtrak disappeared tomorrow, why CSX hasn't spent any infrastructure to solve what your own report says are regularly resulting in multiple hours of main line delays at Gentilly Yard. And there are other parts of the RTC report to refer to infrastructure limitations for freight service having nothing to do with passenger. And because you're here and because it's in that report, I wanted to ask you to address that today. As I said, there's no determination that that's related to how this case should be decided involving Amtrak. There's a great concern, I think, to all of us about better service on your network. So,
yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Yes, you know, you've expressed yourself to me about service levels, I guess, yes, over the last 2 years quite frequently. And I think my response has been about our service levels during that period of time. Unfortunately, it's called a pandemic. It's called a pandemic. There are issues in every industry There are issues in every form of transportation globally. Logistics is tied up globally. Auto plants are shut down globally. Restaurants can't find people to serve coffee in Lincoln Park. This is a problem everywhere. Schools can't find, nurses can't be found. Everybody is out of work. Everybody doesn't want to come back to work. It's been caused by a pandemic. And I've expressed that to you repeatedly over the last 2 years. And God forbid, I wish we hadn't had to go through that. I wish we were back where we were operating in 2019, when the railroad was running at the best in its history. And despite the pandemic, we have continued, our metrics have continued to lead the industry in terms of performance metrics that you put out that measure us on how we're doing. It is not acceptable. It is not the way we want to run the railroad. But our employees, 6,000 of them who have gotten the disease, 35 of them who have died from the disease, have worked their butts off for the last 2 years to serve our customers, and will continue to do so. And hopefully we don't have another variant and we have to go through the same thing again. As to the level of capital investment, we have a $50 billion physical plant that we work very diligently at to maintain. We spend $2 billion a year in capital investments. $2 billion. So during that same period of time, I guess when we pay dividends, we spent a lot more money in capital back into our physical plant and our infrastructure than we did in share buybacks and dividends. Over half of that goes right directly into the infrastructure of the railroad, rails, ties, ballast, to improve the condition, speed, and overall safety of the network. Number one, the safety of the network, and to expand capacity. And yes, this year we're spending $62 million north of Mobile because we see the traffic growth coming out of Mobile and moving up into our network in the eastern half of the United States, up to Birmingham, through Nashville, into Louisiana, to the east, over to Waycross, over to Atlanta, into the Carolinas. We maintain all of that infrastructure with our own private money, and that railroad condition continues to improve year after year after year after year. We have put tons of money into the yard capacity of this railroad in the last 4 years, and that level of investment has increased significantly in the last 4 years since I've been here than what was traditionally spent on yards across the CSX. So our railroad is safer, our railroad is in better condition, and is running better today than it ever has in its history. And at the same time struggling to deal with the impacts of a pandemic. So I can't comment specifically on a footnote on whether or not we spent the appropriate amount of dollars in Gentilly Yard, but I have Mr. Boychuk right here who can directly answer the question.
Well, but I don't understand why you can't answer that question.
Yeah, well, let me follow up with Jim, and I would like to hear from Jamie. Jim, with all due respect, what I read in a footnote is a centerpiece of the RTC report, and what we are being told in the case, and I don't want to get into the case, is all of the restrictions on this line. But the restriction that I just read you, and it's only one of several, but it's the one that really stuck out to me, has absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic. It appears that the limitations and the use of the main line causing multiple hours of mainline delays, that's your consultant's words, not anything that Amtrak came up with, has been there apparently for a long time, long before the pandemic. And according to the numbers filed with us, you haven't spent more on capital than stock buybacks and dividends. It's about $6 billion less over the last 11 years on capital. And I have no doubt that you have spent money on capital, but if this line is such a problem, and from what I know of the network, New Orleans is a centerpiece for all of the class ones to meet, why have you not spent money to solve the problem that your own consultants say is caused by freight traffic having nothing to do with Amtrak? And maybe Jamie can comment on that, but I don't see that this has anything to do with the pandemic.
I think what we did, and you guys were extremely impressed with Mr. Mormon's presentation this morning and what you described, how a study is done in these circumstances. And that is the exact process that we have gone through in this case. That is exactly when I sat down with Mr. Anderson, immediately upon my getting the job as CEO, flew out and met with Senator Wicker and discussed the issue of the Gulf Coast service. Immediately got together with Mr. Anderson and said, Mr. Anderson, we've got noise all over the place. We've got studies from a long time ago putting on passenger trains to Orlando, passenger trains to Jacksonville, $2 billion, $1 billion. We don't have a real study here about what needs to be done to put on service between New Orleans and Mobile. Let's get a study going. That's exactly what we did. We started the RTC study immediately to work forward to get to the solution of where we are today. What is presented in the RTC study, and there might be discussions about whether or not there are delays in Gentilly Yard. There might be a switch that moves this way and that way and another part of the railroad. That is the base case. What we did was laid out the base case.
Well, it's my understanding, and we're told that the RTC study is the gold standard in the industry, and it's used by the railroads repeatedly, not just when Amtrak brings a case, in order to keep your networks up to date, and that all of the railroads, including Amtrak, use them. And so I am wondering, as a matter of ongoing management of CSX, why an RTC study has, I assume they have been done over the years, that revealed these infrastructure inadequacies for freight service, and they have not been remedied, given all of the money that CSX and the other class ones have been taking out of the system. That's the concern. I've raised it before repeatedly, but I've rarely been shown the inadequacy of the infrastructure by your own consultants as we have with the RTC. So that's the reason for my question.
Okay, I don't know that it's an infrastructure issue. We'll ask Mr. Boychuk to explain what the operational challenges are at Gentilly.
So Gentilly Yard, if you look at a map of Gentilly Yard, it is sandwiched in between multiple other yards. So on either side, you've got the state docks who are operating. And beside them, you have the NS yard, you have a CN yard, you have multiple yards that are all sandwiched together. So in order to do any type of infrastructure with respect to building more trackage around there, it's not possible to do that. Where we see any type of delay, in some circumstances today, is planned delay because you may have a coal train that is dumping at McDuffie Island. And if you have a coal train dumping at McDuffie Island and you have another coal train coming up behind it, it will sit there for an hour and two, waiting on the main line or waiting in a yard track for that coal train to be finished. It's a single track structure between downtown and McDuffie Island. That's what multiple people have been talking about. We don't have double track there. We don't have triple track there. And we don't feel that we need to with the way that today is running. If Amtrak was to run downtown, if Amtrak was to run to a station in Mobile, which I think has been mentioned by a number of people throughout the last 2 days, that would cause delay on a single mainline track, which would then could considerably back trains up. You have one bridge, the Canal Bridge, which opens and closes for switching operations. When we switch in that yard, which was probably built well over 100 years ago, we have to switch over top of a moving bridge. We have to get permission, we occupy it, we switch, we clear, and then we start bringing trains in and out throughout the canal. So this isn't an issue with respect to continued growth in the area. We have a good plan for that because the growth, as everyone has mentioned, is heading north more than anything. It's the multiple trains that could occupy the single mainline track downtown. It's a very busy yard.
You're telling me that apparently the delays that are spelled out in the RTC report currently, and I don't mean to single out only Gentilly, it's just I don't want to spend the whole day on every part of the report. That's just one of them, are the way you're going to run the railroad, many hours of delay. And I think we should wait to hear this at the trial, but there's no place for infrastructure improvements. Your proposal in the RTC report is to spend nearly $30 million to build a bypass track around Gentilly Yard, so there must be room for something. But I think rather than dwelling on this at the hearing, and where the experts could get on and tell us, answer some of these questions and put maps up.
Yeah, you know, my apologies. I was talking about Mobile. We're talking about Gentilly Yard, which is New Orleans. So
Yeah.
my apologies there, because what I described for you was the problems with Mobile and where we have the single track. So
Yeah.
Gentilly Yard, you'll hear, I'm sure, from the NS right away, who's going to tell you exactly what happens on the back belt, which is where we have congestion, which is on the back belt getting around to the multiple railroads. So why don't we let them probably speak to that?
Yeah, and
So
Chair
the
Moorman,
question, Jamie, the question is not what NS is going to do, but whether CSX is going to spend some of the billions it sends back to the shareholders to solve that problem, even if Amtrak disappears tomorrow. That's my question.
Well, you have a drawbridge that's just outside as well. So that drawbridge also causes a problem from getting across. But at the same time, with Gentilly Yard, the back belt is where your congestion happens at times. Yeah, you could have a couple of trains that sit beside each other waiting for clearance to get through the back belt. But again, we'll let the NS speak about the problems that they're having on the back belt, because I believe it's not our railroad where the issue is, where we're holding back. So the NS, I believe, will probably be able to speak to this better than anyone, since they are looking for some type of funding as well.
All right, well, let's finish with your part of the panel at this point, and other, I don't want to dwell on this anymore. It's a matter of interest, obviously, relating to service in general and not so to this case. It may come up in this case when we get to the trial. Our other board, I cut you off, Robert. I'm sorry. I just wanted to follow.
No, I think you said what I had to say. I mean, I'm a little disappointed at the response. I think it, lack of transparency. I do think the red herring of COVID and pandemic, is hiding a true response about service. I didn't hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, anything about the back belt when they described the problem of Gentile Yard. So, I just want to get, answers and direct answers, and I don't think we've got them. So, like I said, this is not part of the this trial. So I look forward to a time when we could actually sit down and actually get some real answers. I don't want to hear from NS. I want to hear CSX. So at that time, we can do so. Thanks, Wade.
All right, thanks, Robert. Other board members, questions for Jim or Ray? Karen?
Thank you. And this is a question you don't have to answer here, but given the existing congestion on the freight railroads, have you analyzed what additional benefits there would be to the fluidity of your system from the improvements that you are requesting be made on behalf of Amtrak? In other words, is this just going to solve the Amtrak problem, or will there be benefits to the fluidity of the freight system that also flow from the 400 or 900 or $1 billion in improvements that you want to see before Amtrak can access your lines? So I don't expect an answer here, but that's a question in my mind.
So Member Hudlin, we won't answer it here. We'll defer that to the March hearing and appreciate the line of inquiry.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Jim or Ray? Okay. Stand by, both of you, if you would, because as we go through, the other members of this panel may come back to you. Just ask you to mute yourselves, but that would be appreciated. Next up, Bill Mullins.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman Schultz, members Primus, Fuchs, and Hedlund.
Bill, let me at the outset again apologize to delaying your trip after our last public hearing. Hopefully you will you'll learn not to make any airline reservations in close proximity to our hearings.
I have learned my lesson, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. No trips today. You want me till midnight? I'm here. So.
I can't control only my own questioning, which is some of you may think is not controlled. But why don't you proceed?
Sure. Thank you. And please don't ask me a bunch of questions about Gentilly Yard. I won't be able to answer it.
That was why I diverted the question, because I was sure you couldn't. So go ahead.
But we, on behalf of Norfolk Southern, we want to thank the board for holding this hearing and for allowing all sides to have their views heard. Throughout this proceeding, NS has always supported full public comment. We twice requested the board to allow public comments from everybody. And so we really appreciate the fact that the board held this hearing and allowed all sides to have a view. And in listening to this hearing, there appears to be a little bit of misconception about the freight railroad's position, especially with respect to NS. NS desires to make it clear that NS supports Amtrak service, including on the Gulf Coast. The issue is the process by which Amtrak service is implemented. As you heard earlier, NS has a long history of working with Amtrak and with state sponsors of Amtrak service. You heard from NS's former CEO about the service to Norfolk, to Lynchburg, and in North Carolina. He also mentioned the new Virginia agreement, the so-called Western Rail Initiative in Virginia, which was announced in May and was accomplished through a relatively expeditious process. As you heard, this will bring Amtrak service to the New River Valley for the first time since 1979. The initiative calls for $168 million in infrastructure investments along the NS corridor, with many more millions to be spent on the line that Virginia will purchase. Improvements include better access to Roanoke Yard, siding extensions, and improvements along the I-81 corridor. These improvements are not dissimilar from the infrastructure improvements identified in the Gulf Coast modeling. The expansion of passenger service in Virginia complements the existing Amtrak Northeast Corridor service, and 2 Northeast Corridor round trips will be extended from Roanoke to Christiansburg upon completion of infrastructure improvements in 2025. Indeed, the state will shortly be making its STB filings. The point is that new and extended Amtrak service can be implemented through negotiation, working together, and relying upon proven models, such as the RTC model, which was used in the Western Rail Initiative, and which you have heard from Mr. Moorman and Ms. Drake, that has been the accepted model used for years when examining passenger service and determining what infrastructure is needed to ensure fluidity of both freight and passenger service. As the Western Initiative shows, the process can work. Such a process can work here and was working until Amtrak pulled out. In this case, NS remains willing to sit down with Amtrak at any time and discuss a way to move forward together in a positive, cooperative manner. Yesterday, I was particularly encouraged by the comments of Senator Wicker and Chairman DeFazio. Both of them expressed the need to work cooperatively, the need for infrastructure, and the availability of funding to facilitate increased passenger service. NS shares those goals and commits to working to implement those goals for the Gulf Coast service. NS intends in the March hearing to establish why its requested infrastructure needs are required to ensure the continued validity of the Gulf Coast service for both freight and passenger rail, and for the port and Amtrak as well. Perhaps we can reach agreement before that hearing with dialogue, discussion, and cooperation, perhaps via board-sponsored mediation. We remain willing to discuss all of these issues. Again, thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Chairman, I believe you're on mute. Are you speaking?
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
No questions for Bill? All right. Thank you much, Bill. Will you stay tuned as well while we finish this panel? And of course, we'll see you this afternoon. Bob Wimbush.
First of all, just want to make sure, technical issues here. Can you see me and hear me?
I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, both good morning, Chairman Oberman. You and I are in the same time zone here, and good afternoon to the other members of the board. I want to thank you for extending the port a brief opportunity to offer responsive comments in this phase of the proceeding. And I will be brief, but hopefully not ineffective. The Alabama State Port Authority and its Rail Common Carrier Operating Division, the Terminal Railway Alabama State Docks, or collectively the port, are grateful to the board. We are grateful. You have recognized the importance of this proceeding to the Port of Mobile and to the railroad-borne commerce flowing from, to, and through the port terminal area. And it appears that you are genuinely sensitive to the critical role that the port plays in America's supply chain. Thank you for granting the port full party status, particularly in the face of Amtrak's vigorous and ongoing efforts to diminish the port's role in this case, and its calls to have the board ignore us altogether. Finally, in permitting our intervention, we believe that the board has recognized the very real distinction between the port's interest in this case and those of Amtrak and CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern Railway. Some of the commenters advocating for Amtrak access have indicated that perhaps some railroad infrastructure measures would be appropriate to protect railroad freight service, including in and around Mobile. That is a welcome, cooperative gesture, of course, and it recognizes that Amtrak service has the potential to harm freight service along the proposed route, and that appropriate mitigation measures should be taken. But for now, at least, Amtrak has accepted nothing of the sort. Rather, Amtrak hews to the position that no freight service protecting infrastructure is necessary. So the board must take Amtrak's application as it exists, as an all or nothing proposition, and not as some passenger service proponents envision it to be. To be clear, Amtrak's access demand lacks any definite commitment to fund freight service protecting infrastructure. As such, it is not the proposal that some of Amtrak's supporters seem to think. Yesterday, Congressman DeFazio noted that what is needed here is, and I may be paraphrasing his language here a little bit, a determination on what infrastructure costs are appropriate. He stressed the need for the parties to, as he put it, I believe, come to a number. You have also heard the same things today from Mr. Moorman. But Amtrak has already offered its number when it comes to freight service protections, $0. Amtrak advocates may balk at CSXT's cost estimates, but Amtrak's lack of commitment to fund any freight protecting infrastructure initiatives cannot be any better of a starting point for a board-ordered access proceeding. Regarding yet another critical participant in this case, the port is disappointed that the U.S. Department of Transportation has been disengaged when it comes to freight service impacts in and around the Port of Mobile. As you heard yesterday, Mobile is a major supply chain node, a multimodal transportation hub for the region and the nation. In fact, by tonnage, Gulf Coast ports handle more traffic volumes than all Eastern Seaboard ports combined, and the same goes for all Pacific Coast ports. Mobile, by tonnage throughput, is larger than all but 2 Eastern Seaboard ports and is larger than all but 2 Pacific Coast ports. Mobile handles more than twice the tonnage volumes of Oakland, Seattle, or Tacoma, and approaches the same tonnage throughputs as the Port of Virginia. I should note as an aside that Mr. Moorman remarked in his comments today about Amtrak service to Norfolk that the Port of Norfolk was, as I think he put it, much larger than the Port of Mobile. That isn't true by way of measurement of tonnage throughputs. We actually are approaching Norfolk's numbers right now when you measure it against the Port of Virginia. On the subject of FRA, the port objects to the FRA's endorsement of Amtrak's skewed and irresponsible interpretation of what constitutes unreasonable impairment of railroad freight transportation under 49 USC 24308E. And we have noted in this proceeding that FRA's interpretation of when and how Amtrak is to be afforded preference in dealing with railroad freight service generally is legally unsupported. In endorsing Amtrak's legal interpretation of Section 24308E, FRA would have Amtrak pursue its passenger service prerogative subject only to the most egregious harm to interstate freight commerce. The legal esoterica aside, it would have been better had DOT or its modal administration, FRA, sought to gain a meaningful understanding of the port's rail service concerns and what is at stake for us. Unfortunately, neither has engaged with the port to discuss this matter, much less learn firsthand the port's freight flows and TASD's operations across the CSXT main line to service seaport terminals, and neither has asked to. USDOT seems to be focusing its energies on getting Amtrak what it wants at the expense of freight carriers both large and small. We would have offered DOT a tour of the port's facilities. In the course of DOT's involvement in this matter, it would have been better if transportation officials had taken steps to learn the scope and complexity of TASD's cross-corridor operations so that DOT could better appreciate why the port is so active in this proceeding and why its interests here are unique among the parties. Evidently, DOT isn't interested. But where DOT has passed on the opportunity, perhaps the board will not. Specifically, the port would be pleased to introduce the board to the port facilities to give all of the board members a firsthand, in-person sense of TASD's substantial terminal operations, to show you how we interact and depend upon CSXT to facilitate cross-corridor operations, and how that works, and how it sometimes doesn't, and what introducing 8 new daily Amtrak train movements in the Mobile terminal could do to TASD operations. Perhaps this evidentiary process could be adjusted to allow for that to happen, with each of the parties entitled to be present and take part, of course. It won't be the first time that you've been invited to Alabama during the past 24 hours or so, and we'd love to make it happen. Thank you, and I will remain available for any questions.
Thank you, Bob. You should know that Patrick and I and our attorneys advisors have been to Mobile 2.5 years ago, and we didn't see the port, but we were in Mobile, and then we spent a fair amount of time in Alabama and McIntosh. So we're not adverse to coming to Alabama when the situation is correct. A couple of things I would like to mention quickly, and then see if board members have any questions for you. I appreciate your kind words for what you described as our actions in this case involving the port. But for the record, I want the record to be clear that the only thing the board has done with regard to the port, and the only thing that we would characterize, is what we stated in our order granting intervention. And I know you have characterized it and you're entitled to do that. But for the record, I didn't want to say yay or nay. I just want to say the board's position to date on the port's interest in this case is as stated in our formal decision, nothing more, nothing less at this point. Secondly, I do not speak for the Department of Transportation, but I would observe that I'm not sure where your characterizations come from. I have been personally very involved with John Procari, DOT, on all supply chain issues, which have been very intensely involved in assessing and working with all ports, all intermodal issues. So I'm not sure why you feel Mobile's been ignored. And I would say in this case, DOT has filed an amicus brief which is in the record. And of course, we had a lengthy presentation from Administrator Bose yesterday. So I wouldn't characterize it, and I'm not sure and I don't want to accept your characterization as not being engaged. They've done what they've done, and the record speaks for itself in that regard. And I thought, they're not here to respond to what you said, and I just want to note what's in the record already. With that, let me see if any board members have any questions for Bob. I would say this, Bob, that.
By the way, Chairman, it's Rob, if you please.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, Rob. I apologize. I should know better. Got too much going through my head. Maybe going right through it. I would say that we look forward to your full presentation about impacts on the port at the trial. That's what it's there for.
We do look forward to that. And again, we thank you for giving us the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. All right. If there are no questions for Rob, we will move to Amtrak, Steve Gardner and Jessica Amundsen. And I know there was a concern raised by Amtrak about the allocation of time on this panel. I purposely did not set any time limits for anybody other than the admonition to try to keep your remarks limited in terms of issues that we know we're going to deal with at the trial and in the pre-trial conference this afternoon. Steve, Jessica, whatever you feel you need to present us with, you're on.
Thank you, Chairman Oberman, Vice Chairman Schultz, board members Fuchs, Primus, and Headland. I'm Stephen Gardner, President and CEO of Amtrak, and it's a great pleasure to be here. With my limited time, I'll focus my remarks on the issue in this case that board members must decide. Has CSX and NS proven that restoring Amtrak service between New Orleans and Mobile would impair unreasonably their freight transportation? Unless the public provides $440 million for capacity investments before the first train even leaves the station. As Congressman DeFazio and Administrator Bose discussed yesterday, the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, creating Amtrak, represents what the board and the Supreme Court have called a bargain between Congress and the private railroads. Under this law, Congress relieved the private railroads, who were then experiencing large financial losses which jeopardized their viability, of their common carrier obligation to provide intercity passenger rail service, in return for making their tracks available to Amtrak to carry out this obligation. The railroads eagerly embraced that bargain, but not all lived up to it. Some quickly began to impede and delay Amtrak's efforts to add additional trains and demanded what Congress called inordinate capital improvements. By 1980, Congress had had enough of what it characterized as the railroad's intransigence. It enacted Section 24308E to create an expedited procedure to allow Amtrak to operate additional trains unless a railroad proved such trains would cause, quote, serious adverse impacts on freight operations. Since then, Amtrak has generally found a cooperative path for adding new and additional service with our host partners. But we have now encountered exactly the circumstances which led to the creation of this law, and thus bring our first case under this section to you to ensure that after 6 years of delay, our hosts abide by their obligation to accommodate Amtrak's needs on their network. As you heard yesterday, many communities and elected officials from both parties are clamoring for expanded Amtrak service. In response, Amtrak unveiled last April its preliminary vision called Amtrak Connects Us for expansion of service across the nation. It would bring our route network, which has not materially grown since 1971, even though the nation has added 120 million people, into the 21st century, and expand mobility and economic opportunity, all while helping to reduce highway congestion and aviation congestion and greenhouse gas emissions. As Senator Wicker and Administrator Bose described yesterday, Congress and the administration have endorsed the vision of Amtrak expansion and provided historic levels of funding for it. The Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, enacted just last year, includes $58 billion for FRA and Amtrak intercity passenger rail investments. Importantly, while crafting this bill, Congress did not alter the several statutory provisions that ensure Amtrak's access to host railroads remains on reasonable terms. A top priority as we implement the IIJA in partnership with FRA and our state partners is addressing the needs for Amtrak service in the Southeast, the region most glaringly underserved by Amtrak today. Returning service to the Gulf Coast, which was suspended in 2005 following Hurricane Katrina, is both good transportation policy and a matter of regional equity. You have heard from many speakers that expansion of passenger rail service requires collaboration among Amtrak, states, and freight railroads. And that's exactly what Congress intended when, in the FAST Act of 2015, it created the Gulf Coast Working Group led by FRA to plan restoration of this service. The other members of the working group included Amtrak, CSX, and the Southern Rail Commission. However, as Administrator Bose and the members of the SRC told you yesterday, CSX wasn't interested in that collaboration and did not participate in good faith. CSX ultimately refused to join the working group's 2017 report to Congress, which concluded that Gulf Coast service could resume with just over $5 million for station improvements and identified additional investments totaling $95 million that would benefit both Amtrak and freight service over time, which we generally support. In stark contrast to the working group's approximate $100 million estimate, CSX demanded over $1.1 billion in upfront investments for operation of two daily round trips. NS, which owns less than 4 miles of the route on which there is one freight train per track mile every 3 hours, also insisted upon large capital investments. After 3 more years of negotiation, Amtrak agreed in February of 2020 to CSX's and NS's demands for a capacity modeling analysis using RTC, Rail Traffic Controller, as a model. The agreement provided CSX's chosen consultant with a full year to complete the modeling. Unfortunately, it quickly became apparent that the RTC modeling would serve no purpose other than to obfuscate and delay. CSX and NS instructed the consultants to use unilaterally determined assumptions and inputs which they refused to share, not only with Amtrak, but with FRA, which was paying for the modeling. When the 1-year agreement expired, Amtrak was told the completion of the flawed modeling was still many months away, and FRA pledged to halt funding it because it was essentially useless to them without transparency into the model inputs. Given the clear congressional directive to reestablish service along the Gulf Coast, and realizing that only the STB order could make this happen, Amtrak saw no choice other than to initiate this proceeding last March. To be clear, Amtrak agrees with speakers who have characterized capacity modeling as a very useful tool to assess impacts of service changes on rail lines. We use RTC, and I would argue we have some of the best practitioners in the country. But contrary to the impression some have, modeling and capital investments aren't prerequisites to every increase in rail service. Amtrak hasn't required modeling or costly infrastructure investments each time a freight railroad or commuter authority wanted to add trains on our Northeast corridor, the busiest by far rail line in North America. In many cases, additional trains can obviously be accommodated without the need for extensive analysis or infrastructure investments. Amtrak, for instance, didn't demand RTC modeling or drag out negotiations for years when NS wanted to operate 4 additional oil trains a day on the Northeast Corridor in 2013. We found a way to accommodate those additional trains amidst the hundreds of trains a day we already host without any capacity improvements. NS and CSX don't always use RTC modeling either. CSX agreed last year to allow NS to operate 2 additional 9,000-foot double-stack trains a day between Albany, New York, and Worcester, Massachusetts, without any RTC modeling, or for that matter, any capacity analysis. Like any analytic tool, RTC produces usable outputs when the inputs are accurate. Transparency in the process is critical. When Amtrak and its commuter partners do RTC modeling, they agree upon the inputs and assumptions, and all data used in the modeling is shared. As Ian Jeffries of the AAR and Wick Moorman have told you, that is also the standard practice in the freight railroad industry. But that's not what happened with CSX and NS here. They unilaterally selected inputs and assumptions and wouldn't tell Amtrak or FRA what they were. FRA has called their model an opaque black box with meaningless outputs. To use an analogy, imagine for a moment if one football team got to make up new special rules for the Super Bowl and not tell the other team or even the referee what they were. Of course, that team would win the game. And that's exactly what happened here. The rules CSX and NS made up gave their team only 8 downs on each possession, allowing them to run up the score in their favor. While CSX and NS refused to share with Amtrak and the FRA the data and assumptions they used in the model, thanks to this proceeding, they were required to provide that information to Amtrak's outside lawyers and experts. Here's what we found about their modeling in this proceeding. First, they invented freight trains that don't exist. Their modeling assumes 257% more freight trains than their own data shows actually operated during the period on which it was purportedly based. They assumed that Amtrak would have to mitigate every minute of aggregate freight train delays, their flawed modeling attributed to Amtrak trains. They also ignored operational efficiencies, decreeing that no freight or passenger schedules would be adjusted even slightly to minimize conflicts. They assumed track capacity would be added until projected on-time performance of Amtrak trains reached 95%, a performance Amtrak trains achieved nowhere on their lines today and have never requested here. And they decided Amtrak trains would never be routed through a siding, artificially inflating delays, which caused them to propose building more sidings. But CSX and NS weren't done. They then added projections of large future freight traffic increases in 20 years, even though revenue ton miles on Class 1 railroads are decreasing. This led them to demand even more infrastructure investments, which they insisted Amtrak should fund now to accommodate their speculative 2039 freight traffic projections. Even with all of those flawed and hyperbolic assumptions, the RTC model only showed that our service, if started without any capital investments, would cause average freight train speeds to decrease by just 0.7 of a mile per hour. That is what CSX and NS claim is unreasonable impairment of their freight operations. Based on that, CSX and NS are now demanding $440 million in publicly funded infrastructure investments before we could run on a single train. And I would note, just following up on Mr. Foot's testimony, that that's essentially a quarter of the amount of capital funding CSX apparently spends every year on its infrastructure to fund investments on what is something like 0.7 of the route network. This is exactly the sort of host railroad intransigence and inordinate capital demands that Congress intended the STB to expeditiously curtail when it enacted Section 24308E. Now, Amtrak agrees with the speakers today who have told you that adding Amtrak service on host railroads is best accomplished through agreement, and that it often requires investments in freight railroads infrastructure. In recent years, Amtrak and its state partners have entered into numerous agreements with freight railroads and have funded billions of dollars in infrastructure investments. We all agree that that's necessary at times. And just recently, we reached agreement with Canadian Pacific to add new trains, but some without additional capacity investments, some with. Amtrak and its state partners stand ready to fund reasonable infrastructure improvements along the Gulf Coast corridor to improve Amtrak service and address legitimate areas of concern. There is already more than $60 million in federal and state funds committed or secured for that purpose. However, the $440 million CSX and NS are seeking today is orders of magnitude different from any measure of reasonableness. I'd like to address a few other issues speakers have raised. The railroad industry is hardly the only industry in which Congress has required that those who have control over critical assets provide access to those assets for the public good. For example, cable television company must make available channels for public access and broadcast stations, and telephone companies are subject to universal service requirements that have made telephone service ubiquitous, even in remote rural areas. Some have suggested that given all of the IIJA funding, Amtrak should simply acquiesce in CSX and NS's unreasonable demands. But Congress didn't enact the IIJA to fund the gold plating of freight railroad lines in order for them just to live up to their legal obligations to permit Amtrak operations. Finally, let me debunk myths you may have heard that there is something unique about this route that triggers a need for massive capacity investments to restore Amtrak service. Most of the route is single track, but so is the vast majority of Amtrak's route network. Yes, it has drawbridges, but not as many per mile as Amtrak's Northeast Corridor in Connecticut, yet somehow we still accommodate 68 trains a day over that route. Mobile, of course, has a very important port, but so does Miami, where 34 recently added Brightline passenger trains a day travel over the very rail line serving it. I'll conclude by discussing one issue on which everyone agrees, which is this is a very important case. But first, let me note what's not at stake here. Shippers along the Gulf Coast or elsewhere in the United States have no reason for concern about this restoration of service. As we addressed in our filing, our short station stop in Mobile will not block traffic to and from the port. In fact, the New Orleans to Mobile line was able to accommodate 3 Amtrak trains a day 25 years ago when it had nearly twice as many freight trains as it does now. Nationwide, Amtrak accounts for only about 4% of the train miles on Class 1 railroads, and yet they have managed to flourish despite this. Even if we could implement the entire Amtrak Connects Us vision, our percentage of total rail traffic on host lines would increase only slightly, and such service expansion would be accompanied by billions of dollars in public investments in host railroad infrastructure. What's really at stake here is the question of the carrier's obligation to continue to help us serve the traveling public, and whether Amtrak, USDOT, and our state partners will be able to carry out the administration's and Congress's direction to significantly expand Amtrak service in the U.S. CSX's and NS's opposition, in essence, is that they should be able to decide where and on what terms Amtrak may add additional trains to their lines. But that's not what Congress said in 1970, in 1980, or in the recently enacted IIJA. It's not for CSX and NS to determine that Norfolk may have Amtrak service, but Mobile and Mississippi should be left behind. The board's decision in this case will send an important message to the railroad industry. The problem that led Congress to enact Section 24308E in 1980 has not gone away. Amtrak hopes the board will issue a decision that encourages railroads to fulfill their obligations under the Act and to work collaboratively when Amtrak seeks to exercise its rights to add service over their lines. If so, we believe this should be the last case the board must decide under this section, and we can all get back to working together to grow the important role of rail, both passenger and freight, in our transportation system. Thanks very much for the opportunity to testify today, and I'll note, Mr. Chairman, that our attorney will be saving her remarks for the March hearing.
Thank you, Steve. One observation, one question. The issues that you raised concerning access to data involving the RTC study, we will be discussing this afternoon, to the extent we discuss them at all today. So I didn't want to get into it in this part of the session. So some legal aspects to that. I had one question for you. Early on in your remarks, you, in giving the, and it was very thoughtful, and I appreciate the history is always important and enlightening, particularly to those of us who have come late to your world. You quoted, in talking about what Congress did back in the 80 or the late 70s, you quoted, and I noted it, serious adverse impact. You said that we're supposed to order service unless there are serious adverse impacts. Are you quoting from a committee report? Because that language isn't in the statute. Where are you quoting from?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I am. I'm in fact quoting from the report related issued by Mr. Staggers and the Committee of Commerce here, which had accompanied HR 6837. So that's where the source is.
All right. And are you, I don't have that obviously in front of me. Are you saying that report is talking about 308?
Correct. That's
308E, subsection E?
Correct. Yeah. It does describe exactly the situation that I tried to summarize in my testimony, which was Congress's response after the failures stemming in the 70s from implementation of the Act.
All right. Thank you. That was all I had. Are there any, Karen, you have a question for Steve?
Mr. Gardner, there is one point among, I think, probably a multitude where the parties appear to be talking past each other. And in the course of your putting on your case, maybe you can elucidate it. We have heard from CSX that Amtrak has not made any commitment for the installation of new infrastructure that might accommodate its service. And yet other parties have said and spoken to the fact that there is whatever, $66 million at least available to enhance this project. And so not now, but perhaps in the course of presenting your case, if you would address what would be necessary for you to make a commitment with respect to the infrastructure that could be funded by that amount, or any other infrastructure that, for example, has been suggested by the working group report.
Thank you, Member Headland, and absolutely, we'd be happy to cover that. And to be clear, we stand ready to make investments that improve passenger service and address issues, as I mentioned. That is something we have been open to and discuss, and of course, make across the network.
Does improving passenger service, again, you don't have to answer it here today, imply that at inception, you might be running trains at less than optimal trip times? Again, you don't have to answer that now, but that's an issue I would like to understand better.
We will follow up in the subsequent opportunities. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Steve Gardner? All right. It is now 1:13 by my clock. We're going to recess until 2:15 Eastern. And we will expect all of the attorneys, at least the ones who are here, I assume will be with us. If you have co-counsel, that's fine. I would say to Jim and Jamie and to Steve that if you would like to be present for the pretrial conference, there may be questions that come up that you could facilitate, but I don't think we are requiring it. At this point, but I just want to suggest to you that you're not excluded by any means, and if you think you can be helpful, that that would be fine with the board for you to be present. The only other thing, I am reminded that our tech person, Usha Naik, is going to get on the screen for the moment and give you some direction about technical conference for joining the pretrial, technical information for joining the pretrial conference. Is that correct, Dawn?
Yes, that's correct, Marty.
Oh, now, Usha, there you are. Okay, listen, she's the most important person in this hearing, so everybody pay attention.
So, I just wanted to remind everyone, not everyone on this panelist list is on the panelist list for the hearing conference this afternoon. So if you're not on the panelist for this afternoon, panelist list for this afternoon, you can watch via YouTube. The link is on the STB website, and there is an area called Quick Links on the homepage, and you can watch the live hearing from there. For those who are panelists this afternoon, you will have received an email this morning, a reminder email. And I know you've received a number of emails from STB Hearing, but the email you want to look for this afternoon, for an hour from now, is one titled Panelist for Pre-Hearing Conference, February 16th, 2022. So you want to look for the email that is titled Panelist for Pre-Hearing Conference. And you want to also disconnect from this session here before joining the other one. So this is going to be discontinued in a minute or two. So you will be able to then join the pre-hearing conference, and all the panelists for that should have a link. If you don't have a link for that and you should be participating this afternoon, please send an email to hearings@stb.gov, and we'll make sure one gets out to you. So that was all, Marty. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Usha. Is everybody up to speed on the technology for this afternoon? Okay, We will see you in 1 hour.